Hey everyone, tonight, you're standing in the agora of Athens, dust warm underfoot, the murmur of barter and debate swirling around you. Above, the sun hangs heavy, a gold coin pinned to the blue cloak of the sky. At your feet, a slab of marble, its surface etched with lines you don't yet understand. This is a sundial, one of the first attempts to cage time itself. Not with chains, but with shadow, not with force, but with patience. The Greeks didn't invent the sundial. That honor likely goes to the Babylonians, but they did something arguably more profound. They gave it grace. They took a crude tool and carved into it an elegance, a philosophy. Picture a simple stick, a gnomon, casting its slender shadow across the face of a marked stone. At sunrise, the shadow stretches long and languid, a lazy finger pointing west. By noon, it shrinks beneath itself, like a cat curling into a sunbeam. And as the sun dips, the shadow grows again, reaching eastward, weary, wistful, reluctant to let go of the day. But these early dials weren't precise, and they didn't need to be. Life in ancient Greece moved not with the tyranny of minutes, but with the quiet flow of seasons. A farmer didn't consult a dial to know it was exactly midday. He looked at the shifting shade, the warmth in the air, the behavior of birds. Noon was when the sun said it was noon, not before, not after. Still, within that simplicity lay a resolution, the idea that time could be measured, divided, and, to some extent, tamed. That the movement of the heavens could be captured on stone, that a fleeting thing like a shadow could become a language. The sundial whispered, "Here is the hour. It is yours for now." Historians still argue about who carved the first Greek sundial. Some credit Anaximander, a philosopher of the 6th century BCE, who imagined the earth as suspended in space. Others believe it was craftsmen, nameless and long forgotten, who first drew lines into marble with no intention of becoming immortal. Whoever it was, by the 5th century BCE, sundials had spread across the Greek world. They appeared in marketplaces, on the steps of temples, in the courtyards of philosophers and merchants alike. But here is something your school books may never mention. The earliest sundials weren't used to schedule meetings or track production. They were offerings, devotional objects left in sunlight, etched not just with lines, but with longing. A farmer might carve a sundial not to tell time, but to tell Apollo, god of the sun, "I see you. I follow you. I honor the rhythm you bring." A quiet gesture of reverence, like leaving flowers on a doorstep that no longer opens. Imagine that for a moment, timekeeping as worship, measuring not for control, but for connection. The sundial was a tribute, a bridge between sky and stone, between what moved and what waited. Close your eyes now, feel the imagined warmth of the Greek sun on your cheeks. Listen to the soft bleat of distant goats, the rustle of olive branches. The scent of time drifts on the wind, along with the salt of the nearby sea. Somewhere, a child's laughter echoes. And beneath it all, steady as breath, the slow arc of a shadow creeping forward across a stone face, quiet, tireless, inevitable. To the Greeks, time wasn't merely chronological. They had two words for it. Chronos, the time that ticks, that counts, that ages. And kairos, the right time, the opportune moment, the time of fate. Sundials marked chronos, but life was lived in kairos. When to plant, when to speak, when to love, when to wait. You didn't need numbers for that. You needed wisdom, you needed attentiveness. Philosophers of the era often warned against obsessing over measured time. Plato believed that wisdom came not from knowing the hour, but from knowing when. Aristotle observed that timing was the soul of good action. To live by the sundial, some said, was to risk living like a shadow, yourself present, but never fully alive. Still, the sundials multiplied. As the Greek world expanded, so too did its need for coordination. Ships needed to depart together. Markets needed to open in harmony. Rituals required precision, how else to please capricious gods? And so sundials grew more elaborate, some adjusted for the seasons. Others tilted, curved, compensated for latitude. Timekeeping became a science, but never lost its poetry. Yet even at their best, sundials remained delicate things. A cloud could throw off the reading. A misaligned gnomon could send a whole town to lunch early. There's a story, perhaps true, perhaps not, about a merchant who missed a ship's departure because his sundial was hidden behind a fig tree. He blamed the sun. The magistrate, unimpressed, fined him for negligence and suggested a haircut for his garden. For all their elegance, sundials didn't command time. They reflected it, like a pond reflects the sky, not to define it, but to honor it. They taught a gentle truth, that time moves whether you measure it or not, and that to live well was not to race against the sun, but to walk beside it. Many Greeks came to see sundials as moral teachers. The Stoics, for example, admired how the gnomon stood still, casting its truth quietly. They saw in its shadow a metaphor for human virtue, constant, silent, shaped only by the light. The sundial became not just a clock, but a mirror. It asked, "Where do you stand when the light hits you? What shape does your life cast?" As you listen now, perhaps the room around you has dimmed. Perhaps your own devices glow quietly beside you, marking time in digital pulses. But allow yourself, for just a moment, to drift backward. Back to stone, to sun, to shadows moving like water across marble. No buzzing alerts, no urgent pings, just the hush of a world where time was slow enough to see. And maybe, as you breathe, you begin to understand something the Greeks knew well, that time, like sunlight, is something you feel before you measure. That hours are not just units, but invitations. That every shadow, if you're quiet enough, has something to say. So let the shadow stretch. Let it fall across your day, across your thoughts. Let it remind you not of what you've missed, but of what remains. Time is not a taskmaster, it is a companion. It walks with you, it does not hurry, and neither should you. And when you wake tomorrow, and the light once again finds your face, perhaps soft, perhaps bold, let it remind you that every new day, a sundial of your own. Blank, waiting, patient, ready to reflect the shape of your being. Let the shadow begin again. The earliest sundials did not just measure time, they listened to it. Long before the Greeks etched perfect circles into marble, before philosophers debated the nature of hours and minutes, they were stones. Not polished monuments or civic markers, but ordinary rocks. Stones left in fields, jagged and lichen-covered. The kind a shepherd might rest against while his goats wandered through the dry grass. These stones were not clocks in the modern sense. They were companions, quiet witnesses to the turning world, their shadows shifting slowly, silently, with the passing of the sun overhead. Imagine you are one of those shepherds. You sit beneath the Aegean sky, the heat rising gently from the earth. For days, for weeks, for seasons, you notice the same thing. When the shadow of a particular boulder stretches to touch the edge of a patch of wild thyme, it is time to gather the goats and begin the slow walk home. You never write this down, you never measure it, but you know it. Your body knows it, the land knows it. Time, in this world, is not divided, it is felt. This was timekeeping at its most primal. A rhythm older than scripts or calendars, older than temples or trade. The Greeks, always drawn to metaphor and myth, would later say these stones were the first to learn the language of the sun. Not just passive observers, but students. The shadows cast across these rocks whispered messages, not in numbers, but in seasons and in subtle changes of light. You could say they were the sun's first disciples. But then something changed. Somewhere, perhaps on a hillside, perhaps outside a shrine, a human being picked up a stick and pressed it upright into the soil. The stick's shadow fell across the earth. It moved slowly. Someone noticed. Someone marked where it fell, and the gnomon was born. From this humble moment grew the idea that time was not only something you could notice, it was something you could shape, something you could draw in lines, something you could control. At first the markings were simple. One line for midday, another for the time goats returned, perhaps one more for when the last light slipped away. There were no numbers, No formulas, just sunlight and shadows. But even in this simplicity, something profound was happening. Humans were no longer simply watching time pass. They were beginning to define it, to claim it, to plant their presence into the passing of the hours. There is a detail that most histories overlook. Those early gnomons were more than just instruments. They were boundary stones. A sundial set in a field did not just mark hours. It marked ownership. It said this land is measured. This land is known. This place has been touched by thought, as if by planting a shadow into the soil. A person could declare this patch of earth and sky to be theirs. A quiet assertion of presence. The historian Herodotus wrote of Egyptian sundials and their use in temples and rituals. But the Greeks, always reaching toward abstraction, turned these devices into something more personal. A Babylonian might use a sundial to time a prayer. A Greek might look at its shadow and ask whether time itself had a shape, whether the shadow was truth or illusion, whether the sun was a god or a guide, whether the hours flowed like water or returned like waves. Then came the scaff, a bowl-shaped sundial carved into stone. Picture it a shallow hemisphere with a slender rod rising from its center. Along the inside of the bowl, curved lines stretch like ribs, delicate and intentional. As the sun moves, the shadow arcs across the inner surface, not just marking the hour, but tracing the path of the seasons. It was not only a clock, it was a calendar. It was a miniature version of the cosmos itself carved into stone. Some scholars say the scaff was invented by Berossus, a Chaldean priest who brought Mesopotamian knowledge to the West. Others argue it was the Greeks who refined it, added elegance, and gave it meaning. But if you were to come upon one today, tucked away in a quiet temple courtyard, none of that would matter. You would see the bowl catching light. You would see the shadow glide across the stone like a hand passing through water. You would feel the steady presence of time moving without sound. Of course, sundials were far from perfect. They made mistakes, lots of them. A sundial in Sparta might disagree with one in Corinth by more than an hour. There was no standard, no time zones, no agreement on where the day began. Cloudy skies made them useless. Winter shadows stretched further than summer ones. A small tilt in the gnomon could shift the entire reading. But these errors were not seen as failures. They were part of the rhythm. Time was still breathing, still flexible. The Greeks did not mind. They shrugged, smiled, and poured another cup of wine. If you missed a meeting because your sundial was off, that was life. If the clouds moved in and the hour became uncertain, so be it. The point was not precision, it was presence. To be aware of the movement of light. To live in a world where a shadow could be a teacher. Here is something rarely mentioned. Some of the earliest sundials were intentionally wrong, not by accident, by design. A temple priest might tilt the gnomon just slightly so that the shadow reached the prayer hour line a little earlier. That way, the congregation would gather on time, even if the sun was running behind. It was a small manipulation, a playful bending of time. Even in the ancient world, people were already nudging the truth to fit their needs, and perhaps that is what makes these devices so human. They are tools, yes, but also mirrors. They reflect not just the sun, but the people who watch it. As you stand in the imagined quiet of a sunlit field, the stone warm beneath your hand, you begin to hear what the ancients heard. Not ticking, not alarms, but a whisper, a slow, patient voice saying this moment is here. This hour is yours. There is no urgency, no countdown, just the golden slant of light across rough stone. A single gull cries in the distance. Olive branches sway in silence. The shadow moves, not in haste, but with grace. It does not chase. It does not lead. It simply is. And in its quiet progression, it reminds you of something we too often forget. Time is not meant to be chased. It is meant to be witnessed. Let the shadow stretch. Let it pass. Let it teach. You find yourself in the heart of ancient Greece, where the sun does not simply shine. It speaks in angles and arcs. Its voice is silent, but ever-present, a golden language inscribed not in letters but in shadows. The Greeks were not content to merely bask in its warmth. They observed, questioned, measured. To them, sunlight was not just illumination, it was geometry waiting to be understood. Each ray was a message from the heavens, and the Greeks, being the curious thinkers they were, set out to decipher it. You are standing now in the courtyard of a wealthy Athenian's home. White marble columns rise around you, their surfaces glowing faintly beneath the sun's gaze. Beneath your fingers is a sundial smooth, deliberate, masterfully carved. Your hand drifts along the surface of the stone, tracing the shallow grooves etched into its face. Each line represents an hour, each mark the result of careful observation and mathematical thought. Nothing about this dial is accidental. Everything is in perfect dialogue with the earth and the sky. The brilliance of Greek sundials lies not just in their form, but in their philosophy. They understood that timekeeping was not an act of domination over nature, but a partnership with it. They knew that the sun's path was not fixed, it changed with the seasons. In summer, the sun climbs high, and at noon, shadows draw short and compact. In winter, the sun stays low, and the shadows grow long, stretching across the ground like lazy animals in the afternoon light. The Greeks observed all this and adapted their instruments accordingly. Unlike earlier cultures that made static markers, the Greeks refined sundial design to reflect their location on the globe. The gnome on the upright rod casting the shadow was not placed arbitrarily. It was tilted at an angle that matched the latitude of the place. In Athens, this meant an angle of about 38 degrees. This simple but profound adjustment ensured that the sundial could accurately reflect the shifting positions of the sun throughout the year. It was a marriage of stone and sunlight, grounded knowledge and celestial observation. Now imagine being the first person to realize that daylight itself was not constant. To see that midsummer brought the longest stretch of sun, while midwinter offered only a pale sliver of light. Shadows behaved differently depending on the time of year, not just the time of day. That realization must have been both humbling and exhilarating. The Greeks did not stop at noticing. They measured. They created sundials with our lines adjusted for solstices and equinoxes. They even experimented with interchangeable gnomons to account for the differences in solar altitude between seasons. Here is a detail both remarkable and often overlooked. Some Greek sundials included curved lines known as analemmas. These curves compensated for the fact that the sun does not travel at a constant speed across the sky throughout the year. The Earth's elliptical orbit makes the sun appear to hurry some days and lag behind on others. These early timekeepers anticipated what we now call the equation of time. Without telescopes, without modern algebra, they saw the irregular rhythm of the heavens and tried to catch it with stone. The philosopher Anaximander, often credited with introducing the sundial to Greece, might have been astonished to see how his simple gnomon evolved. What began as a vertical stick casting a shadow became an array of sophisticated designs. There were flat horizontal dials and concave ones, conical dials and vertical wall dials. There was even the pelicanon dial, shaped like a double-headed axe, with separate sets of our lines for morning and afternoon. These were not just tools for telling time. They were sculptures, philosophies, and works of devotion. As you study one now, perhaps the same one in that Athenian courtyard, you notice how art and science dance together. The hour lines do not march in rigid precision. They radiate outward like sunbeams, or they curve gently across the surface like vines or waves. They are calculated with precision but laid out with grace. The Greeks could not resist bringing beauty into function. A sundial was not just a mechanism, it was a mirror of the cosmos, a micro-universe that reflected their ideals of harmony, balance, and elegance. Historians often speak in awe of the Antikythera mechanism, a mysterious bronze device recovered from a shipwreck. It is astonishing, yes, but the more common sundials scattered throughout Greece are just as telling. They show a culture obsessed with time not as a prison, but as a puzzle. Consider the Tower of the Wines in Athens, an octagonal building with 8 sundials, one on each face. As the sun traveled across the sky, each dial came into play. Morning, noon, afternoon, each had its moment, each cast its story in shadow. Now close your eyes and imagine the act of reading such a dial. It is not instant, there is no quick glance, no backlit screen. You must approach it slowly, align your body to the light, squint to see where the shadow lands. Sometimes you must move around the dial, find the right angle, wait for the sun to emerge from a passing cloud. Time does not shout here, it reveals itself in whispers, requiring your attention, your respect. It invites you into stillness, into thought. Around you, the air is warm and scented with herbs, perhaps rosemary or thyme. The marble beneath your feet holds the day's heat. A bee drifts past, briefly alighting on the gnomon. Its tiny form casts its own shadow, momentarily overlapping the larger one in a silent communion. Somewhere in the distance, the blacksmith's hammer strikes metal in rhythmic intervals, another form of timekeeping one heard rather than seen. But here, in this quiet courtyard, the hours pass with light alone. The sundial before you is not speaking of deadlines. It is not urging you forward, it is offering you a place in the turning world. Its lines do not divide time, they invite you to witness it. You become aware of the present moment, not through urgency, but through observation. The shadow moves, yes, but slowly, so slowly you almost do not notice. And yet, there it is, advancing, marking the passage of something too vast to rush and too precious to waste. And so you stay a little longer, not because you must, but because the sundial teaches you how to stay, how to be still, how to see time not as a force pressing upon you, but as a quiet rhythm you can join, a dance between shadow and stone, between knowledge and wonder, between the earthly and the eternal. Let the shadow move, let it stretch across the marble. Let it take its time, and let yourself do the same. The warm marble of the sundial still tingles under your fingertips as we begin to slip, almost without noticing, into a quieter realm. This is not merely the world of stone and sunlight, but the place where timekeeping and mythology intertwine. For the ancient Greeks, nothing important was ever just practical. A dial was never just a dial, a shadow was never just a shadow, and a sundial, etched with careful lines and crowned with a slender gnomon, was never just a tool, it was a story waiting to be told. According to one legend, the very first sundial was not crafted by human hands at all, it was a gift from the divine. Helios, the radiant sun god, tired of mortals constantly interrupting his celestial journey to ask what time it was, finally lost his patience. As the story goes, he hurled a glowing spear down from the heavens. It struck the ground near a temple on the island of Rhodes and stood upright, casting a perfect shadow as it circled throughout the day. The priests gathered around, stunned. There, Helios is said to have thundered, "Now you can stop bothering me." And with that exasperated act of divine charity, the first sundial was born. Of course, the tale is almost certainly a myth. But like many Greek stories, it contains a seed of truth hidden inside the poetic embroidery. It reveals how the Greeks viewed time itself not as a dry sequence of hours to be counted, but as a celestial phenomenon, a fragment of heavenly knowledge brought down to earth. The sundial was not simply a machine, it was a message, a gesture from the gods reminding mortals of the grand design that moved above them. In other versions of the myth, the sundial is credited not to Helios, but to Prometheus, the rebellious titan who stole fire from Olympus and gave it to humankind. Some poets say that Prometheus, ever defiant, also taught mortals how to read the sun's movement and how to cast sticks into the ground to follow its path. In this telling, the sundial becomes a symbol of resistance, a tool not merely of measurement, but of defiance. Another secret stolen from the divine pantry, a declaration that human beings, though small, could understand the workings of the universe? Whether the gift came from an irritated sun god or a cunning titan, the result was the same. The sundial became part of the spiritual fabric of ancient life. This spiritual view of time was not confined to stories. As you stand before a real sundial placed in the sacred courtyard of a temple, you begin to see how deeply this symbolism shaped Greek architecture and ritual. Many sundials, especially those found in temple precincts, were not placed casually. They stood close to altars, often within view of statues dedicated to Apollo, the god of light, logic, and proportion. Apollo, more widely worshipped than Helios, embodied the very principles the sundial expressed. He was the god of harmony, of balance, of reason, of mathematics. A sundial, in its silent symmetry, became a stone tribute to these ideals. The shadow it cast was not random, it moved in order, in grace. It showed not just the time, but the invisible structure of the day. To stand near a sundial was to be reminded that time, like music, had rhythm. Like a poem, it had meter. Like a temple, it had proportion. Some ancient sundials went even further than this. They were designed with purpose and ceremony in mind. During specific religious festivals, particularly the solstices and equinoxes, a gnomon's shadow might touch a carved mark or word inscribed into the stone. At the summer solstice, the shadow might fall directly upon the phrase "the gods are watching" or "the sun stands still." These were not ordinary clocks, they were instruments of sacred timing. Their movements matched not only the position of the sun, but the rhythm of prayer, sacrifice, and divine observance. Decorative elements on these sundials often reflected their cosmic connections. One might feature the chariot of Helios engraved in relief, wheels ablaze, horses wild-eyed and galloping across the upper edge. Another might show a pair of wings stretched around the gnomon, as if the sun itself had flown down to rest on the stone. Some were inscribed with brief poems or riddles. One famously read, "I count only sunny hours. For the rest, ask Zeus." The line drew laughter in the ancient world, and perhaps a bit of frustration too, since even in Greece, clouds had a way of arriving uninvited. As the day draws to a close, something subtle changes. The sundial before you begins to fade into shadow. The sharpness of its lines softens. The angle of the light becomes more oblique, more golden. The gnomon's dark finger stretches and blurs. Soon, there will be no shadow to read, only the stone itself. But even this quiet dimming was meaningful to the Greeks. Many believed that the sundial's daily disappearance reflected the sun god's descent into the underworld. When the shadow vanished, Helios had begun his nighttime journey across the other side of the world. Some ancient mystics believed that sundials retained energy even in darkness. They claimed that touching a sundial at midnight, especially on the night of a full moon, might grant a vision of the future or a dream sent by the gods. Others said that a sundial placed beside a burial site could help guide the soul of the departed toward the sun's rising path. These beliefs may seem fanciful now, but they speak to how fully the sundial had been absorbed into the spiritual imagination of the people. The air around you cools as evening gathers. The warm light has faded into a silvery hue. You catch the scent of olive oil burning in temple lamps. Crickets begin their rhythmic music in the dry grass nearby. Their song, steady and repetitive, creates a kind of natural metronome, a sound-based reminder that time still flows even after the sun has slipped away. You reach out and run your hand gently along the edge of the sundial. The stone is cool now, but you can feel the faint smoothness worn into it by generations of hands before yours. Perhaps those hands belonged to priests or philosophers, farmers or warriors. Perhaps they, too, stood here at dusk, pondering whether the sundial was truly a divine gift or just another clever invention cloaked in poetry. It does not matter now. What matters is the moment, the stillness, the slow fading of light. The sundial, though blind at night, still holds meaning. It has become a relic of both science and myth, reason and reverence, a bridge between the celestial and the human. And so, as you stand there in the deepening twilight, the sundial no longer tells you the hour. Instead, it tells you a story of gods and men, of shadows and sunlight, of questions whispered to the sky and answers written in stone. Time, it seems, was never just about minutes, it was always about meaning. Let the shadow sleep. Let the stone remember. Let the night fall gently, and let yourself dream of sunlit hours yet to come. The gnomon stands alone in the center of the sundial, slender and silent, unassuming yet immeasurably profound. At first glance, it is just a stick and upright marker, a thin blade of stone or bronze rising from a carved face of marble. But this is no ordinary rod. This is perhaps the most important stick in human history. As you stand before it, you reach out instinctively, half expecting it to radiate warmth from centuries of sunlight. Instead, it is cool beneath your fingers, smooth where countless hands have brushed across its edge. This simple vertical form is the gnomon, and though it may look modest, it holds the secrets of the sky. It is the first true hand, casting a shadow that sweeps across the dial's surface like the delicate finger of the cosmos itself. In its quiet turning, it tells a story not just of hours, but of seasons, of solstices, of the dance between earth and sun. It does not tick or chime. It moves with grace, tracing time with light and shadow. In the earliest days of its use, long before philosophers carved its name into scrolls, the gnomon was a mere staff placed into the ground. A shepherd would watch its shadow grow and shrink, using it to guess when to gather his flock or return to the village. A farmer would glance at its length, deciding whether to rest beneath the olive trees or continue plowing. It was not science yet, it was habit, intuition, a dialogue between land and light. But the Greeks, with their love of questions and patterns, transformed this humble post into something astonishing. They realized that the shadow it cast did not wander randomly. It followed arcs, and those arcs followed rules. And rules, to the Greek mind, meant one thing: mathematics. Geometry bloomed from the soil. They began to record the way the shadow lengthened in winter and shortened in summer. They noted its shifting angles at dawn and dusk. They divided the day not with bells or water, but with the lean of sunlight across carefully marked stone. Here is a lovely truth. The word gnomon comes from the Greek for one who knows, as though the stick itself had wisdom hidden within it. As if, by watching its movement, a person might learn more than just the time, they might glimpse a portion of the eternal. And, indeed, they did. By tracking the angle of the gnomon's shadow at sunrise, the Greeks could tell what season they were in. At noon, the length of that shadow revealed how far they stood from the longest or shortest day of the year. They could read the sky without ever looking up. The gnomon's movement was not a straight sweep. It traced elegant curves across the dial's surface, sometimes a gentle hyperbola, sometimes a sweeping crescent. At the equinoxes, it would draw near-perfect straight lines. In summer, the curve grew longer, more dramatic, and in winter, the arc was delicate and narrow. These changes told the Greeks that time itself was not fixed. It breathed, it bent, it followed cycles too large to see in a single glance. Of course, the gnomon had its quirks. Around noon, especially in summer, the sun stood nearly overhead. The gnomon's shadow shrank so small it was nearly invisible. Imagine an Athenian philosopher standing in a courtyard, staring intently at a patch of marble, trying to decide whether it was truly midday or if the shadow was merely hiding. This inconvenience sparked a beautiful innovation. Instead of planting the gnomon vertically, they began to tilt it. The angle matched the latitude of the city. In Athens, that meant a tilt of about 38 degrees. This adjustment allowed the shadow to fall more clearly, even at the sun's highest point. This clever tweak turned the gnomon from a guessing stick into a precision instrument. It is not an exaggeration to say that this small shift helped shape how time would be measured for centuries. What was once a fleeting shade on the ground became a readable marker, something that could be studied, standardized, and shared. Time became visible, reliable, a companion to daily life rather than a mystery to guess at. Some gnomons were not content with mere functionality. On the island of Delos, a sundial survives where the gnomon is shaped like a miniature obelisk. Its sides are carved with patterned spirals, waves, geometric stars. When the sun strikes at the right angle, these patterns cast secondary shadows, creating dancing shapes across the dial's face. On certain feast days, the shadow would align with decorative motifs, forming diamonds or even symbolic animals. The sundial became theater. Time became spectacle. Beauty and utility were, as always in Greece, inseparable, but no tool is perfect. The gnomon, for all its elegance, was utterly powerless against clouds. On overcast days, the shadow disappeared, the dial went blind, time vanished. There were no bells to ring, no ticking gears to carry on. The Greeks accepted this with humor. Some sundials bore inscriptions like, "I count only sunny hours," a dry joke, perhaps, or a gentle reminder that even the best minds must bow to nature's whim. Stand there now, in that imaginary courtyard. The sun is high. The gnomon casts a long, thin shadow across the carved R lines. But as you look closer, something unexpected happens. Your own shadow falls onto the dial. Mingling with the gnomon's, you become part of the mechanism, your presence recorded in light. For a moment, you and the sundial are one. A lizard skitters across the dial's base, its tiny limbs scattering dust, its delicate form briefly merging with the shadow's edge before vanishing into a crack. The air around you is still, heavy with the smell of warm stone, old earth, and distant time. A soft breeze stirs the leaves of a nearby fig tree. Somewhere beyond the walls, the low murmur of conversation drifts in from the street. But here, in this sunlit circle, time is measured not by voices or clocks, but by the slow shift of shadow. It is quiet here, not silent, but deeply still. The gnomon does not rush. It does not argue. It simply continues its patient arc, as it has for generations. And so you stay a little longer. You sit on the warm marble ledge and watch the shadow move. Not quickly, not urgently, but steadily. It passes across the ancient grooves, touching each R with reverence. It reminds you that time is not always something to fear or chase. Sometimes, it is enough to witness it, to feel the present stretch out like sunlight across stone, to know, for once, exactly where you stand in the day. Let the gnomon cast its shadow. Let the dial receive its wisdom. Let time unfold not in seconds, but in slivers of golden light, and let yourself be still enough to see it. Step into the Athenian agora at high noon, and you are stepping into a moment suspended between earth and sky. The sunlight falls strong and unwavering, and across the open square, shadows perform a silent choreography. Dozens of sundials, some carved into great stone pedestals, others modest discs no wider than a plate, decorate the space with subtle authority. Each casts a shadow that moves slowly, predictably, and together they form a public orchestra of time. This is not the private ticking of a pocket watch. This is time spoken aloud, time turned outward. Here in the agora, time belongs to the people. You can almost hear it in the rhythm of daily life. Merchants begin packing up their goods as the shadow reaches the market clothesline carved into the dial near the fountain. Philosophers glance briefly at the marble timekeeper near the shaded colonnade of the Stoa, then begin their afternoon lectures with measured calm. The sundials do not shout, they whisper, and yet their presence shapes the day, drawing invisible boundaries between morning and noon, between commerce and contemplation. The Greeks did not merely inherit sundials, they elevated them. More than that, they shared them. In earlier civilizations, timekeeping had been the privilege of priests, astronomers, or kings. But the Greeks brought sundials into the agora, the gymnasium, the theater. They turned time into a common language. One need not be wealthy or literate to read a shadow. All one had to do was look. And so these instruments of light and stone became democratic. They belonged to all citizens, regardless of wealth or station. Unlike the clepsydras, the water clocks often tucked away in private rooms or guarded temple spaces, sundials were wide open to the sun and to society. They stood at crossroads with gentle inscriptions, "Pause and read me," "Traveler," Time became not only measurable, but visible. It greeted you as you walked past the olive cellar. It marked the hour when the gymnasium filled with young athletes. It reminded the actor to begin his monologue just as the sun reached the third hour. The placement of these dials was never careless. Each sundial was oriented with a kind of civic mindfulness. Their shadows were designed not to clash but to complement. Like carefully tuned instruments in a public orchestra, they played in harmony with the needs of the city. Near the courthouse, the dial was set to give precise readings in the early hours of morning, when most trials were held. In the baths, the dial was calibrated to signal midday, when the water, warmed by hours of sun, would be most inviting. Even time had zones, even shadows had civic duty. And these shadows did more than measure, they commanded. A sundial placed outside the military barracks, according to the historian Xenophon, was used to regulate training exercises. Soldiers drilled by the shadow's decree, marching to the rhythm of light. In the political heart of Athens, the Nix, another sundial, kept time for the democratic assembly. Orators stood before their peers, impassioned and persuasive, but always aware of the creeping shadow that would end their allotted time. Some, it is said, would position themselves so their own bodies obscured the gnomon. A subtle cheat, an ancient version of stealing minutes from the clock. Not all sundials were purely functional. Some gleamed with ambition. Wealthy patrons, eager to leave a lasting mark upon the city, donated elaborate dials as gifts to the public. These were more than timekeepers, they were monuments. Sculpted from marble or bronze, they often featured ornamental gnomons shaped like animals, mythological figures, or sacred symbols. A dolphin leaping across the hour lines, a satyr grinning mischievously as his outstretched arm marked the time. These dials bore inscriptions that read like poems of ego. So and so, son of so and so, gave this to the people. Many of these ornate dials had multiple faces, one for morning, one for afternoon, one for seasonal adjustment. The most impressive could tell not just the hour but the season, the solstice, the equinox. Some had curved surfaces, some flat, and a few rare examples even incorporated small water channels to compensate for cloudy days. Though the sun had to cooperate, the dial's presence was enough to inspire a sense of order, a promise that time, when visible, belonged to the city. But nothing is perfect. Sundials, for all their elegance and civic utility, had limitations that even Greek ingenuity could not entirely overcome. On cloudy days, the agora's rhythm stuttered. Without shadows, the invisible metronome of the square disappeared. Some merchants closed early out of habit. Others waited too long, unsure. Disputes arose. And during winter, when the sun rode low on the horizon, shadows grew so long they would sometimes stretch across multiple hour lines at once, blurring distinctions. Is it the 5th hour or the 6th? Time, like the sun, occasionally played tricks. Even the very definition of noon caused quiet debate. Should it be when the shadow was shortest, or when the sun was due south? Different city-states held different conventions. A traveler might arrive from Corinth to find Athenian hours lagging or racing ahead. These subtle differences reflected more than measurement, they reflected philosophy. To define noon was, in some sense, to define order. And order was always up for discussion. Now the light changes. You stand before a reconstructed sundial in the modern agora, where the ruins of pillars keep watch over cafes and gift shops. This dial, carefully aligned by archaeologists, once stood beneath the open sky of Pericles' Athens. Its markings are faint now, but still legible. The gnomon casts a slender shadow across the ancient lines. Just beyond, a tourist in sandals checks the time on their smartphone. The contrast is almost theatrical, old and new, silent and buzzing, sun and circuitry. You catch the scent of roasted coffee drifting from a nearby cafe. A breeze stirs the paper on an empty chair. The shadow wavers slightly, then continues its steady creep. For a brief moment, time seems to pause, not in the digital screen, but in the play of sunlight across worn marble. You wonder how many people, across how many centuries, have stood just as you do now, watching that same line grow longer, inch by patient inch. And in that quiet moment, something ancient stirs. You realize that the sundial is not only a relic, it is an invitation. An invitation to slow down, to listen with your eyes, to observe rather than rush. The Agora of Athens may be ruined in stone, but in sunlight and shadow, it still breathes. Let the merchants close their stalls. Let the philosophers begin again. Let the shadows stretch where they may. Time remains, unfolding not with sound, but with grace. And here, in the open heart of the city, you are welcome to read it as it moves. The sundial's shadow stretches across the courtyard of the academy, its movement so imperceptibly slow it might as well be still. It lies long and narrow across pale marble tiles, like a forgotten thought resting in the sun. Around it, students of philosophy gather in loose robes, some seated cross-legged beneath fig trees, others leaning on the cool stone walls, eyes half closed in contemplation. They are caught in a different kind of time, one not measured in minutes, but in musings. The courtyard is hushed, filled only with the low murmur of discourse and the occasional rustle of olive leaves. Here, timekeeping becomes more than practical, it becomes a question. It is said that Aristotle once paced this very stonework, walking in slow, deliberate circles around the gnomon as if its shadow might answer the questions his mind could not. Did time exist apart from its measurement, or was time merely the name we gave to change, to motion, to shadow itself? These were not idle questions. They struck at the foundations of reality, of being, of existence itself. For the philosophers of Athens, the sundial was not merely a device, it was a metaphor drawn in light and stone. Plato, the great teacher of many who walked these paths, is believed to have designed a hemispherical sundial for his academy. More than just a tool to keep track of lectures, it was a visual expression of harmony, a bowl of carved stone whose curved interior mirrored the imagined dome of the heavens above. The gnomon's shadow moved across it like a slow hand brushing the sky, marking not just the hour, but the alignment of human inquiry with cosmic rhythm. Students would sit around it, heads tilted, debating not what time it was, but what time meant. One of their favorite thought experiments was deceptively simple. On a cloudy day, when the sun did not shine and the gnomon's shadow disappeared, did time still pass? Some said yes, that time was a river flowing beneath all things, silent and unseen. Others said no, that time existed only when observed, only when light created shadow, only when motion left a trace. In these debates, the sundial became something more than an instrument. It became a paradox made visible, a conversation between heaven and earth, between permanence and impermanence. Pythagoras, long before the academy's founding, saw more than hours in sundials. He saw numbers, ratios, and patterns. He observed that in his native Samos, the gnomon's shadow at noon during the equinox was exactly equal to the height of the gnomon itself, a perfect 1-to-1. To him, this was not a coincidence, it was a divine signature. The gnomon, he believed, was a channel through which the harmony of the cosmos revealed itself in measurable form. His followers crafted sundials with our lines shaped in sacred geometries, starbursts and triangles, believing that proper alignment could harmonize the soul with the sky. Some of these geometric sundials still survive, worn by time but faintly legible. Archaeologists argue over their meanings. Were they expressions of mathematical devotion, tools of ritual, or were they simply beautiful experiments by those who believed that if the universe had order, then surely that order could be inscribed in stone? To walk among them is to feel both the logic and the longing of ancient minds, reaching out to grasp something that lies just beyond numbers and shapes. Meanwhile, the Stoics saw in sundials a different lesson. For them, the moving shadow was a silent teacher, reminding all who watched it that each moment is both fleeting and final. There is a tale of a Stoic master who, during his lessons, would pause mid-sentence and point to the sundial beside him. He would say, "See how it moves, and yet makes no sound. that is how your life passes. Stoic schools sometimes place sundials at their entrances with carved warnings lines like "You count the hours, but who counts your hours?" Or, as this shadow fades, so too does your time. Timekeeping, for them, was not about organization, it was about awareness. The historian Posidonius even designed a special sundial that tracked the changes in shadow length throughout the year, using it not just to tell the hour, but to show the cycle of seasons, the dying of autumn light, the long sleep of winter, the return of spring's clarity. His sundial was a kind of calendar carved in marble, a demonstration of nature's persistent turning. To stand before it, he said, was to be reminded that everything rises, fades, and returns. And yet, for all their profound reflections, the philosophers were not immune to the mundane difficulties of solar timekeeping. Xenophon once wrote bitterly about the inconvenience of sundials giving different times in different cities, complaining that one could leave in the 5th hour and arrive in the 8th, only to be told both cities were correct. Heraclitus, who famously declared that all things flow, probably smiled at how no shadow ever fell in exactly the same way twice. And Socrates, if one is to trust Plato's dialogue, had a habit of showing up late, perhaps too absorbed in wondering what late really meant. Now, as you return to the present moment, you find yourself in a grove where imagination and memory blur. The late afternoon sun leans gently across the academy's courtyard. The gnomon's shadow stretches, long and delicate, tracing the western side of the dial like the final line of a poem. It trembles faintly in a breeze that carries the scent of crushed pine needles and distant fig trees. Near a low bench, a student leans over a tablet, scribbling ideas with a stylus dipped in ink. Wax melts slowly in a lantern nearby, a second kind of clock. Somewhere deeper in the garden, laughter echoes light, spontaneous, unburdened. Perhaps someone has just made a joke about time, or about philosophers arguing over how to measure what cannot be held. The sound drifts upward into the olive branches, caught there for a moment, before vanishing into sky. And the shadow continues its crawl, uninterrupted, unhurried, like a sentence without a final period. Here, in this quiet corner of ancient thought, time reveals itself not in seconds, but in the spaces between ideas. The sundial stands not to control, but to witness. It does not demand you move faster, it invites you to move deeper. Each hour carved into its surface is both a measurement and a meditation. Each shift of the shadow, a breath, a whisper from the sun. You linger a little longer, watching the shadow make its way toward evening. In doing so, you join the countless thinkers before you who did the same. They asked questions not to find answers, but to see more clearly. And now, in the hush of the falling light, time does not pass, it unfolds. Before you stands a sundial, but not merely a sundial. It is a fusion of function and beauty, a structure where the scientific precision of astronomy meets the artistic elegance of sculpture. Its presence in the garden is quiet, but commanding. Around its circular face, delicate acanthus leaves curl in low relief, their carved petals unfolding in patterns that seem too organic to be stone. For a moment, in the soft Mediterranean air, you feel as if they might stir, moved by a breeze that exists only in memory. The sundial's stillness masks the subtle genius embedded within it. At the center of this marvel rises the gnomon, the part that casts the shadow by which the sun marks the hour. But this is no cold spike of iron or plain rod of brass. This gnomon has been given form divine, dynamic form. It is a sculpture of Eros, the Greek god of love, captured in eternal flight. His wings stretch gracefully behind him, and his slender arm reaches forward in an elegant, weightless pose. From his fingertips extends a fine arrow, and it is the shadow of that arrow's tip which glides across the stone, marking the passage of the day. Time, here, is not pushed forward by machinery, but drawn gently onward by a god's hand. This sundial does not measure time in the way a modern clock does. It does not tick, hum, or blink. Instead, it marks the hours with quiet reverence. Beneath the dial, an inscription carved into the marble declares, "I mark the beautiful hours." These words are not mere decoration, they are a declaration of philosophy. Time, in this place, is not simply a commodity to be managed or spent. It is a gift to be observed, a procession of moments worthy of attention. Each hour is not just a number, it is an experience, a sliver of light to be cherished. In ancient Greece, the creators of such sundials were not just craftsmen. They were artists, mathematicians, astronomers, and philosophers rolled into one. Their work demanded both creativity and precision. The most gifted among them were known by name and honored for their intellectual labor. One sundial unearthed in Pergamon bears a proud inscription, "Dionysodorus made me." This is not just authorship, it is authorship as identity, a signature of intellect carved in stone. Such names were remembered, passed down not only for the beauty of their work, but for the minds behind it. Designing a sundial required deep knowledge. These artisans dealt with complex geometry, using principles of spherical trigonometry to calculate the position of the sun at different times of year. The gnomon had to be tilted to match the latitude where the dial would stand. The hour lines, too, were not straight, but curved, each one calculated to correspond with the shifting arc of the sun across the sky. Some sundial makers recorded their methods in detailed treatises, complete with diagrams and equations. Their manuscripts, recopied by scholars in later centuries, preserved a discipline that balanced rigorous science with delicate craftsmanship. The materials used in a sundial spoke volumes. In city markets and rural fields, people used simple limestone dials, functional, plain, unadorned. These were tools of the everyday. But in the gardens of philosophers, in the atriums of noble houses, and on temple grounds, the sundials became more than instruments. They were expressions of wealth, taste, and learning. Some were carved from cool, white Thasian marble, others from the rich purples of Egyptian porphyry. The most luxurious bore inlays of semi-precious stones, lapis lazuli to mark dawn, its deep celestial blue catching the first light, or rose quartz and malachite to reflect the changing moods of the afternoon. One particularly extravagant sundial, described in an inventory scroll found on the island of Delos, featured our lines inlaid with silver, gleaming softly in the sun. Its gnomon, made from gold and polished to brilliance, reflected light across the courtyard, drawing eyes and admiration. This was not just a timekeeper, it was a statement of cultural identity, a shrine to leisure and intellect. The owner of such a piece did not merely keep time, they honored it, elevated it, displayed it as an extension of their own refinement. Greek artisans also infused their sundials with a sense of wonder and play. Some experimented with optical illusions, what later artists would call anamorphosis. One famous example from the 3rd century BCE required the viewer to stand in a very particular place for the hour lines to make sense. From any other angle, the dial seemed chaotic. But from the chosen vantage point, order emerged from disorder. Time fell into place, but only if you knew how and where to look. It was a philosophical gesture as much as an artistic one, a reminder that clarity comes from alignment. Another sundial from Rhodes featured a concave face, designed to exaggerate the movement of the gnomon's shadow. Each hour seemed to rush forward, the shadow leaping across the dial in bold arcs. It turned the passage of time into performance. The sundial became a kind of stage, where the day enacted its quiet drama. To observe it was to be drawn into time's procession not just intellectually, but emotionally. You did not merely know the hour, you felt its passing, its urgency, its beauty. Yet these masterpieces were not immune to change. Time did not only move across their surfaces, it altered them. Many sundials still standing today bear traces of recalibration. New hour lines were carved when their owners moved to a new city, or when improved astronomical knowledge revealed the old ones to be imprecise. A famous sundial in the Athens Museum shows 5 overlapping sets of hour marks, each one etched over the previous like a layered manuscript. This quiet palimpsest reveals generations of people trying to realign their understanding of the heavens. In trying to measure time, they left behind a record of their evolving place within it. Now the sun has begun to lower. Eros' outstretched arm casts a longer, softer shadow. The light fades, and the markings on the marble grow faint. Soon, they will vanish entirely. This, too, is intentional. The sundial does not serve the night. It retreats with dignity, surrendering its role to the stars. You reach out and touch the stone cool, smooth, worn by time and reverent hands. The acanthus leaves curl in eternal silence. Eros still hovers, wings poised in flight. And in this hush, you understand, the sundial was never meant to dominate time, only to honor it. It does not command the hours. It invites you to notice them, to feel them, to let them pass, not in haste, but in wonder. High noon in ancient Greece was not just a moment on a sundial. It was a daily challenge, a crisis of precision in a world that revered harmony and calculation. As the sun climbed to its zenith, the gnomon's shadow shrank until it became a confused stub, hovering uncertainly at the sundial's center. You stand before one of these ancient instruments, watching as its clear geometry falters. This was the shadowless hour, a term the Greeks whispered with both reverence and frustration. At this peak, even the most carefully crafted sundials grew silent, their carved lines rendered useless by the sun's blinding directness. This was more than an inconvenience. It struck at the foundation of solar timekeeping. Midday was not just another hour. It was when guards changed, markets closed, and sacred rituals began. And yet, in that crucial window, the primary instrument for measuring time offered only ambiguity. The sun, moving too slowly across the sky near its apex, failed to cast a decisive shadow. It was as though time itself hesitated, caught in a moment of celestial indecision. Some Greek engineers attempted clever solutions. They carved concave dials to stretch the noon shadow. They added extra markers for estimates like half noon or first pass peak. But none could overcome the core issue. Geometry met its match in the stillness of the zenith. This challenge gave rise to the hemispherium, a bowl-shaped sundial that caught the shadow in when it tried to vanish. These devices allowed the shadow to move gracefully along a curved interior rather than disappearing. In such dials, noon was not an absence but a transition. Unfortunately, hemispheria were expensive. Most were mounted in temples or civic buildings, beyond the reach of everyday citizens. Their mathematical elegance came at a cost. For ordinary Greeks, solutions were more practical and humble. One common trick was to scatter fine flour around the gnomon's base. Even the faintest shadow darkened the white powder, allowing the eye to catch what would otherwise be invisible. Another method used water droplets on polished stone, forming crude lenses to amplify the blur into a visible edge. Some cities employed an entirely human workaround. Noon watchers stood by the main sundial, tracking the shadow's shrinkage with experienced eyes. When they judged the shadow to be at its absolute shortest, they would shout across the agora, "Now is noon." Their voices became the communal clock, a living solution to a celestial flaw. This blend of astronomical observation and social performance reveals the Greeks' ingenuity. They did not demand perfection. They adapted to the sun's quirks with creativity and resilience. Ironically, those with the most elaborate sundials were often the most inconvenienced. Wealthy citizens favored vertical dials mounted on villa walls, carved from imported marble and adorned with mythological motifs. But at midday, these prestige objects failed entirely. The sun's direct overhead light erased their shadows completely. Meanwhile, peasants using rough horizontal dials scratched into earth or wood fared better. Though simple, these tools allowed the absence of a shadow itself to serve as a rough marker of noon. In a strange twist of fate, it was the poor who remained most punctual at midday, while the rich waited for shadows that refused to fall. Historians continue to debate how this daily uncertainty shaped Greek life. Some scholars suggest it fostered a culture of flexibility. Midday, rather than being a fixed moment, became a window. Meals might begin before or after noon, depending on interpretation. Others point to surviving legal codes that penalized officials for being absent at true noon, suggesting elaborate systems of shadow observation must have existed. Perhaps the reality varied by city-state. Spartan warriors, less concerned with philosophical precision, likely shrugged and moved on. In contrast, Athenian administrators and astronomers may have pursued increasingly intricate methods to define a moment that nature refused to offer clearly. In some city-states, temples took responsibility for announcing midday. Priests would interpret the signs, sometimes aligning religious ceremonies with the exact moment the sun began to tilt westward again. A shadow reappearing on sacred stone was a sign not just of time's passage, but of divine favor. Such rituals became interwoven with civic life, lending sacred significance to a moment of astronomical ambiguity. Meanwhile, philosophers used the shadowless hour as a metaphor. For the Stoics, noon became an image of the self in balance, the soul suspended at the center of judgment, beyond impulse and motion. For Platonists, it symbolized the pure realm of forms, an unmarked reality behind the visible world. For ordinary citizens, however, it was just that odd moment when the shadow vanished and no one could agree whether lunch had started or not. As you linger beside this imagined sundial, you begin to notice the world reacting in its own quiet ways. Ants march undisturbed across the stone face, casting their tiny moving shadows like a dance of miniature hour markers. Their oblivious precision offers a curious contrast to the human struggle nearby. From across the courtyard, the aroma of baking bread drifts on the air. Someone's midday meal is guided not by mathematics, but by hunger and habit. There is no trumpet blast or official bell. Instead, there is warmth, rhythm, instinct. Time, for a few short moments, seems to dissolve into presence. In this narrow gap between clarity and confusion, the world is suspended. The sun hovers directly above, casting its authority without opposition. Light floods the dial, but leaves no mark. Time, which has marched so visibly all morning, takes a breath. The day holds its pose like a dancer balanced at the peak of motion. And then, almost imperceptibly, change returns. The gnomon's slender finger begins to stretch eastward. The shadow reappears, shy at first, then certain. The spell of the shadowless hour breaks. Time resumes its orderly procession. Merchants look up, philosophers nod. The world, once again, is divisible by hours. In this simple return, there is something sacred. The sundial does not complain. It waits, and in waiting, it teaches. It reminds us that not all of time is measurable. Some of it must be lived without markers, felt without instruments. For a civilization obsessed with measure, the Greeks understood this paradox well. The moment of noon, unmeasurable and uncertain, may have been their most honest hour of all. Even now, in museums across the world, ancient sundials sit beneath sterile lights, frozen in stone and story. Tourists lean in, reading inscriptions without knowing that these timepieces once failed to mark the very hour that now dictates their lunch breaks. We may smile at their shortcomings, but perhaps we should instead admire their honesty. They recorded not only precision, but mystery, not only knowledge, but silence, and maybe, just maybe, that makes them the most accurate clocks of all. High noon in ancient Greece was never just a moment on a sundial. It was a daily paradox, a fleeting crisis of precision in a culture that revered harmony, proportion, and mathematical clarity. As the sun climbed to its highest point, the gnomon's shadow tool so trusted for tracking time would shrink until it nearly vanished. You can imagine standing before one of these instruments, watching the dial's clear geometry falter, its etched hour lines suddenly irrelevant. This was the Amchanon Hora, the shadowless hour, whispered with a mixture of reverence and frustration. At the zenith, when light was most direct, even the most perfectly calculated sundials went silent. Time, for a moment, slipped from the grip of human design. This wasn't simply a technical inconvenience. It touched the foundations of how time itself was understood and honored. Midday held immense cultural weight. It was the moment for guard changes, for sacred rites, for the closing of markets, and the turning of daily rhythms. And yet, at this exact moment, the sun's stillness at its apex betrayed the instruments that people relied upon. The shadow refused to cooperate, collapsing into a blur or a stump, trembling indecisively at the dial's center. It was as if time itself had paused, uncertain. Greek engineers sought remedies. Some carved concave dials to elongate the shrinking shadow. Others added auxiliary markings, first past peak, or half noon, to estimate the midpoint. But none could overcome the geometric fact: the closer the sun to overhead, the less it shadows anything at all. In response, a remarkable innovation emerged: the hemispherium, a bowl-shaped sundial whose curved interior caught the gnomons' shadow in when it tried to vanish. With this design, noon was not an absence but a smooth transition, as the shadow curved gently along the inner surface. It was a graceful solution, elegant in form and in mathematics. But like many beautiful things in ancient Greece, it was expensive. Hemispheria were found in temples, civic centers, or the homes of wealthy patrons. For the average person, they remained out of reach. In their place, humbler strategies arose. Some scattered flour or chalk dust around the gnomon's base. Even the faintest shadow darkened the white surface. Others placed droplets of water on polished stone to act as crude magnifiers, making the blur of light easier to interpret. Some communities developed an entirely social solution. In bustling agoras, experienced observers known as noon watchers would stand beside the main sundial. With trained eyes, they tracked the shrinking shadow until they judged it had reached its shortest point. Then, across the square, they would shout, "Now is noon." Their voices became the public clock, a communal announcement bridging the limits of stone and sun. This was not just timekeeping, it was performance. A blend of astronomy, custom, and human judgment, it turned imperfection into ceremony. The Greeks, always attentive to the drama of life, adapted to the sun's indifference with imagination, not complaint. Ironically, those with the grandest sundials suffered the most from the noonday ambiguity. Wealthy citizens often favored vertical dials mounted on villa walls, sculpted from fine marble and adorned with mythological reliefs. Yet these prestige objects, facing outward with artistic flair, were utterly useless when the sun stood overhead. At the very moment they were most needed, they failed. Meanwhile, simpler horizontal dials scratched into the dirt or carved onto wood provided clearer cues. For the poor, the absence of a shadow itself became a sign. Paradoxically, it was the humble who were often most punctual at midday, while the elite waited for shadows that refused to appear. Historians still debate how this daily uncertainty shaped Greek life. Some scholars believe it encouraged flexibility. Rather than viewing noon as a precise instant, it became a window, a stretch of time understood through social consensus. Meals, prayers, and public duties shifted according to custom, not calculation. Others point to civic laws that penalized lateness at true noon, implying that city-states may have developed elaborate observation systems, perhaps even rotating teams of noon announcers. In militaristic Sparta, such philosophical concerns likely gave way to practicality. Noon came when the captain said it came. In contrast, Athenian officials and astronomers may have spent countless hours refining ways to define a moment that nature insisted on blurring. Temples, too, played their part in decoding midday. In some cities, priests assumed responsibility for announcing when noon had arrived, basing their decision on solar signs and sacred markers. The reappearance of a shadow on consecrated stone might signal the beginning of a ritual or festival. Noon was not merely temporal, it was spiritual. Its fleetingness became part of its meaning, a sacred silence at the center of the day. When the sun began its descent, casting light once more where it had paused, it was read as a blessing. The gods had turned their gaze westward, and time could resume. Greek philosophers, never content to let a phenomenon pass unexamined, saw a metaphor in this midday ambiguity. For the Stoics, the shadowless hour represented a soul in balance, still, centered, beyond impulse. The absence of shadow mirrored the absence of conflict. For Platonists, the noon light stood for pure form light so direct it left no illusion, a realm of truth unfiltered by the material world. But for the average citizen, it was simpler than that. It was the moment when no one could agree if lunch had started. And that, in its own way, was a kind of truth too. As you linger beside one of these ancient sundials, whether real or imagined, you begin to see the world react. The ants crossing the dial's surface do not hesitate. Their tiny shadows move like delicate clock hands, unconscious of the philosophical debates around them. Nearby, the smell of warm bread drifts from a kitchen. Someone's midday meal is guided not by mathematics, but by hunger and routine. There is no bell, no announcement, only rhythm. In this soft gap between clarity and confusion, the world continues. Time does not stop, it simply becomes unspoken. Then, almost without notice, the moment passes. The sun dips the slightest degree westward. The gnomon's shadow reappears, at first just a suggestion, then a certainty. Time, having taken its breath, resumes. The dial once again becomes articulate. Merchants stir from shade. Scribes raise their styluses, and the philosophers resume their meditations, nodding as if they have returned from a brief and sacred silence. The world resumes its divisions, hours, duties, sequences. But for a moment, all had rested in unity in shadowless light. And in that moment, we glimpse something profound. The sundial, often viewed as a symbol of control over time, reveals its limits. It teaches not just how to measure, but how to wait. It accepts its own failure with grace, not as a flaw, but as a fact of nature. Time cannot always be divided, captured, or known. Some of it must be felt. The Greeks, in their wisdom, did not rage at this. They adapted, invented, listened, and perhaps we should do the same. For even now, in our world of atomic clocks and digital seconds, there are still moments when the hands go still, when only presence remains. And in that pause, we too may find a kind of truth that no instrument can record. Beside the sundial stands its ancient companion and rival, the clepsydra, or water clock, known to the Greeks as the water thief. You watch as a narrow stream of liquid trickles from a bronze vessel, each droplet falling with a soft, musical rhythm. The sound is steady, deliberate, almost hypnotic. It marks time not with shadow, but with motion, and sound, a quiet reminder that the passage of moments can be measured not only by the heavens, but by the earth itself. Unlike the sundial, bound to daylight and weather, the clepsydra works in darkness, under cloud, within walls and temple chambers where the sun never enters. And yet, for all its practicality, it never eclipsed the sundial in the Greek imagination. Why? The answer, layered and philosophical, reveals how the Greeks perceived time not just as a sequence, but as a symbol. The earliest clepsydras were humble tools, bowls with small holes at the bottom, filled with water, to time courtroom speeches. A litigant was granted a bowlful of water. When it emptied, so did their right to speak, simple, effective, and democratic. But Greek ingenuity soon transformed these vessels into intricate instruments. By the 5th century BCE, multi-chambered clepsydras emerged, featuring flow indicators, calibrated drainage systems, and in rare advanced examples, gear-driven mechanisms reminiscent of the later Antikythera device. These were not just timers, they were expressions of mechanical curiosity, designed with the same mathematical passion that guided Greek architecture and astronomy. In theory, they offered precision. In practice, however, they posed complex challenges. One major problem was environmental sensitivity. The viscosity of water changes with temperature. A cold morning in Athens made the flow thick and sluggish, while the heat of noon caused it to run faster. Thus, the same clepsydra might measure different durations depending on the weather. Attempts to fix this ranged from the clever to the desperate. Some substituted water with olive oil, which flowed more consistently, but not flawlessly. Others created adjustable holes or overflow basins to stabilize the drip rate. These modifications were ingenious, but delicate, prone to clogging, miscalibration, or simply wearing down with time. Unlike the sundial, which required only the sun, the clepsydra demanded maintenance, observation, care. Still, the Greeks didn't abandon the clepsydra. Instead, they expanded its uses into areas the sundial couldn't reach. In medicine, physicians used small water clocks to measure a patient's pulse. In astronomy, where long nights and clouded skies prevailed, clepsydras offered continuity for observations. In temple rites, performed indoors or at night, the quiet drip of the clepsydra served as both clock and symbol, measuring sacred intervals in hushed reverence. The sound itself, gentle, constant, added a sensory dimension to the ritual experience. Unlike the sundial's silent authority, the clepsydra whispered, it moved, it diminished, it ended. In this, it became more than a tool, it became a metaphor for human life, finite, flowing, fragile. Indeed, some Greeks developed deep emotional attachments to their clepsydras. Inscriptions found on gravestones and temple offerings speak of water clocks as treasured objects. One surviving epitaph tells of a widow who donated her husband's clepsydra to a sanctuary, possibly the same one that marked his final days. Its rhythm may have been the last sound he heard, or perhaps it measured the duration of his prayers, or the time between breaths near the end. Such intimacy was rare with sundials, which stood in public squares, rigid and communal. The clepsydra, by contrast, entered the home, the sick room, the sanctuary. It kept time for private lives, not just public order. This quiet rivalry between sun and water, between the cosmos and the human scale, became a philosophical tension. Advocates of the sundial saw it as aligned with nature's highest order, the sky itself. It needed no intervention, no upkeep, just light and patience. Clepsydras, they argued, were fragile, fussy, and demanding, like a servant needing constant attention. Yet defenders of the clepsydra saw it differently. To them, it represented autonomy from the sky's fickleness. It worked on stormy days, at midnight, in shaded libraries where scholars worked long past sunset. The sundial, they would say, only keeps time when the gods are kind. The water clock works when men must. Over time, hybrid devices emerged, testament to the Greek desire to unite opposites. Archaeologists have uncovered a 2nd century instrument from Kos that combined a sundial with a backup clepsydra. When clouds blocked the sun, a valve released water, initiating the secondary timing mechanism. Another prototype used dripping water to rotate a dial, compensating for the changing angle of the sun throughout the year. These devices were not only brilliant feats of engineering, they were symbolic harmonies. They sought to reconcile the eternal with the ephemeral, the sky's cycles with the fluidity of life below. Stand near a clepsydra, and you begin to understand its subtle power. Focus on the sound, and it becomes a pulse in the room, each drop carving its tiny silence. Lose focus, and it disappears, merging into the background like rain. This duality, demanding and gentle, precise and fading, explains why water clocks never fully replaced sundials. They required human attention. They had to be filled, calibrated, cared for. They failed when neglected. The sundial, however, asked for nothing. It stood in the open air, resolute and constant, its truth written in shadow and stone. And therein lies the clepsydra's tragic flaw. It was brilliant, adaptable, and often more accurate under certain conditions, yet it depended too heavily on human presence. It faltered in the face of neglect. A forgotten refill, a clogged spout, a tilted base, and time went awry. Unlike the sundial, which was corrected only by the sun's return, the clepsydra could be corrupted by clumsy hands or absent minds. It lacked the divine stillness of the heavens. It moved too much, aged too visibly. Where the sundial was eternal, the clepsydra was mortal. And yet, for all its fragility, the clepsydra remains profound. To the philosopher, it represented the passage of time as irreversible. One drop lost could never be reclaimed. Its motion was not cyclical but linear. Where the sundial traced the day's circle, the clepsydra described descent, a gentle fall from fullness to emptiness. It spoke of endings, it warned of time's erosion. And perhaps that is why some Greek thinkers loved it best. They saw in it a mirror of human experience, brief, flowing, unrepeatable. A sundial marked the turning sky, a clepsydra marked the beating heart. Now, as the rain passes, sunlight returns. A shaft of golden light slips through the clouds and stretches across the courtyard, illuminating a stone sundial. Its gnomon casts a bold shadow once more. In the background, the clepsydra continues to drip steady, faithful, and undeterred. Two timekeepers stand together. One looks upward, reading the stars. The other looks downward, listening to the earth. Between them lies the essence of time itself. The Greeks understood this balance, that time was both cosmic and personal, both public and private, both immortal and perishable. In keeping both the sundial and the clepsydra, they kept watch over the fullness of human life, not just its hours, but its meaning. The winter sun hangs low over Athens, casting elongated shadows that stretch like taffy across the agora. You watch as the gnomon's dark finger points far beyond the summer markings, rendering the sundials carefully carved are lines nearly useless. This is not a flaw of design, but a shift in the sky itself. As the earth tilts on its axis, the sun's angle changes, and the geometry of time must adapt or fall silent. What you are witnessing is timekeeping's great seasonal crisis, when the sun's altered path demands the Greeks recalibrate not just their instruments, but their entire understanding of time. In antiquity, sundials didn't operate on fixed hours the way modern clocks do. Instead, the daylight was divided into 12 equal seasonal hours, regardless of how long the sun stayed in the sky. A winter hour might last as little as 45 modern minutes, while a summer hour could stretch to 75. This meant that time itself expanded and contracted with the seasons, a rhythm that influenced everything from market hours to mealtimes. In Greek texts, references to an activity taking 3 hours could vary wildly in duration depending on the time of year. To the ancients, this wasn't inconsistent, it was natural. The challenges of winter were not limited to short days. The low sun angle caused shadows to lengthen dramatically and blur at the edges, making precise readings difficult. The light came in at such a shallow angle that it exaggerated every imperfection in the dial's surface. Frost could crack stone faces, while rain would pool in the concave bowls of hemispherical sundials, turning precision into puddle. Some wealthy households simply switched to indoor water clocks during the winter months, although these came with their own frustrations. The oil or water used for flow control thickened in the cold, distorting time measurements and requiring constant recalibration. Some public buildings employed servants whose entire job was to tend to sundials in bad weather. They would wipe off rainwater, sweep away snow, and even scatter light-colored powder at the gnomon's base to help shadows stand out on dark days. This was timekeeping as maintenance, a human effort to hold back the blur of seasonal entropy. The Greek solution was not to resist nature's changes, but to work alongside them, crafting timepieces that acknowledged the limitations of their creators. One clever method used to address seasonal variation was the addition of auxiliary hour lines for winter use. These lines curved far beyond the summer markings, stretching across the dial face like spider legs reaching outward. These are known today as winter analemes. A few particularly advanced sundials featured markings for solstices, equinoxes, and even monthly hour shifts. The Tower of the Wines in Athens, for instance, featured 8 separate sundials facing in different directions to ensure that at least one would function properly throughout the year. It was a marvel of adaptation, blending architecture, astronomy, and civic pride into a single timekeeping statement. The effects of seasonal sun changes were so significant that they influenced the layout of entire cityscapes. Builders oriented certain buildings to maximize exposure to winter sunlight, particularly when those buildings housed sundials. In the sacred precinct at Delphi, the temple of Apollo's columns were placed so that sunlight during the winter solstice would shine between them and fall upon a specific marker. This was not coincidence, but design and intentional use of architecture to track the heavens. At the sanctuary of Amphiaraus, dedicated to healing and prophecy, the main sundial was placed so that the winter sun illuminated the statue of the god at a specific hour each day. Pilgrims waiting to consult oracles or seek cures watched as the light struck the face of the deity, a celestial appointment made tangible. Time, in this context, was not only measured but revered, interwoven with faith and expectation. And yet, for most citizens, time remained practical. A merchant in winter might glance at the length of his shadow relative to a crack in the pavement. That crack, worn deeper over generations, became a kind of unofficial seasonal time marker. Without needing to consult our lines, people learned to estimate time by watching how shadows fell on familiar landmarks. This folk knowledge, though rarely recorded, formed the rhythm of everyday life. It was time told not by instruments, but by habit and observation. Winter sundials bore the wear of their utility. Many surviving examples show winter hour lines more deeply etched or more heavily worn than their summer counterparts. Some even have entirely separate sections carved later to accommodate changing needs. The stone tells a story of adaptation, of tools evolving with the needs and limitations of their users. Time, it seems, demanded both patience and ingenuity. Philosophers, too, contemplated the effect of the season. Some mused that winter time reflected the human condition stretched thin, difficult to define, lacking in clarity. It reminded them that time was not a fixed entity, but a relationship between the sun and the soul. The Stoics embraced the ambiguity, seeing in the long shadows a lesson in endurance and acceptance. Time was imperfect, they argued, and so were we. To live well was not to demand precision, but to move gracefully within imperfection. The Greek attitude toward winter timekeeping was one of philosophical resignation paired with clever design. They accepted that accuracy would waver and sought instead to design systems that adapted rather than resisted. The idea of rigid time, locked into uniform hours, would not arrive until the invention of mechanical clocks many centuries later. For the Greeks, time was not a prison but a dance, a flexible rhythm that changed with the sky. As you stand beneath the low winter sun, feel how it barely warms your skin. The light, though beautiful, offers little comfort. Your breath fogs in the chill air, rising briefly before vanishing. Nearby, a baker packs up early, guided not by our lines, but by the lengthening shadows creeping across his stall. Somewhere, a temple priest watches a beam of sunlight slide across a stone wall, ready to begin the ritual that marks the shortest day of the year. Time, here, is not counted, it is watched, felt, responded to. The gnomon's shadow now lies beyond the dial's edge, lost in the irregular stone of the agora. It points to a place where time escapes measurement, where precision gives way to intuition, and perhaps that is winter's true lesson. In the season of least light, time becomes more human, more forgiving. We do not control it. We join it, stumbling occasionally, adjusting always, trusting that the sun, though distant, will return. And so it does. The winter solstice passes, and the days begin to lengthen once more. Slowly, shadows shorten, the sundial regains its clarity. But for now, in this still moment, you remain suspended in the long twilight of winter time, a time that asks less for accuracy and more for presence. The winter sun hangs low over Athens, casting elongated shadows that stretch like taffy across the agora. You watch as the gnomon's dark finger points far beyond its summer markings, rendering the sundials carefully carved our lines nearly useless. This is not a flaw of design, but a shift in the sky itself. As the earth tilts on its axis, the sun's angle changes, and the geometry of time must adapt or fall silent. What you are witnessing is timekeeping's great seasonal crisis, when the sun's altered path demands the Greeks recalibrate not just their instruments, but their entire understanding of time. In antiquity, Sundials didn't operate on fixed hours the way modern clocks do. Instead, the daylight was divided into 12 equal seasonal hours, regardless of how long the sun stayed in the sky. A winter hour might last as little as 45 modern minutes, while a summer hour could stretch to 75. This meant that time itself expanded and contracted with the seasons, a rhythm that influenced everything from market hours to mealtimes. In Greek texts, references to an activity taking 3 hours could vary wildly in duration depending on the time of year. To the ancients, this wasn't inconsistent, it was natural. The challenges of winter were not limited to short days. The low sun angle caused shadows to lengthen dramatically and blur at the edges, making precise readings difficult. The light came in at such a shallow angle that it exaggerated every imperfection in the dial's surface. Frost could crack stone faces, while rain would pool in the concave bowls of hemispherical sundials, turning precision into puddle. Some wealthy households simply switched to indoor water clocks during the winter months, although these came with their own frustrations. The oil or water used for flow control thickened in the cold, distorting time measurements and requiring constant recalibration. Some public buildings employed servants whose entire job was to tend to sundials in bad weather. They would wipe off rainwater, sweep away snow, and even scatter light-colored powder at the gnomon's base to help shadows stand out on dark days. This was timekeeping as maintenance, a human effort to hold back the blur of seasonal entropy. The Greek solution was not to resist nature's changes, but to work alongside them, crafting timepieces that acknowledged the limitations of their creators. One clever method used to address seasonal variation was the addition of auxiliary hour lines for winter use. These lines curved far beyond the summer markings, stretching across the dial face like spider legs reaching outward. These are known today as winter analemas. A few particularly advanced sundials featured markings for solstices, equinoxes, and even monthly hour shifts. The Tower of the Wines in Athens, for instance, featured 8 separate sundials facing in different directions to ensure that at least one would function properly throughout the year. It was a marvel of adaptation, blending architecture, astronomy, and civic pride into a single timekeeping statement. The effects of seasonal sun changes were so significant that they influenced the layout of entire cityscapes. Builders oriented certain buildings to maximize exposure to winter sunlight, particularly when those buildings housed sundials. In the sacred precinct at Delphi, the Temple of Apollo's columns were placed so that sunlight during the winter solstice would shine between them and fall upon a specific marker. This was not coincidence, but design and intentional use of architecture to track the heavens. At the sanctuary of Amphiaraus, dedicated to healing and prophecy, the main sundial was placed so that the winter sun illuminated the statue of the god at a specific hour each day. Pilgrims waiting to consult oracles or seek cures watched as the light struck the face of the deity, a celestial appointment made tangible. Time, in this context, was not only measured but revered, interwoven with faith and expectation. And yet, for most citizens, time remained practical. A merchant in winter might glance at the length of his shadow relative to a crack in the pavement. That crack, worn deeper over generations, became a kind of unofficial seasonal time marker. Without needing to consult our lines, people learned to estimate time by watching how shadows fell on familiar landmarks. This folk knowledge, though rarely recorded, formed the rhythm of everyday life. It was time told not by instruments, but by habit and observation. Winter sundials bore the wear of their utility. Many surviving examples show winter hour lines more deeply etched or more heavily worn than their summer counterparts. Some even have entirely separate sections carved later to accommodate changing needs. The stone tells a story of adaptation, of tools evolving with the needs and limitations of their users. Time, it seems, demanded both patience and ingenuity. Philosophers, too, contemplated the effect of the season. Some mused that winter time reflected the human condition stretched thin, difficult to define, lacking in clarity. It reminded them that time was not a fixed entity, but a relationship between the sun and the soul. The Stoics embraced the ambiguity, seeing in the long shadows a lesson in endurance and acceptance. Time was imperfect, they argued, and so were we. To live well was not to demand precision, but to move gracefully within imperfection. The Greek attitude toward winter timekeeping was one of philosophical resignation paired with clever design. They accepted that accuracy would waver and sought instead to design systems that adapted rather than resisted. The idea of rigid time, locked into uniform hours, would not arrive until the invention of mechanical clocks many centuries later. For the Greeks, time was not a prison but a dance, a flexible rhythm that changed with the sky. As you stand beneath the low winter sun, feel how it barely warms your skin. The light, though beautiful, offers little comfort. Your breath fogs in the chill air, rising briefly before vanishing. Nearby, a baker packs up early, guided not by our lines, but by the lengthening shadows creeping across his stall. Somewhere, a temple priest watches a beam of sunlight slide across a stone wall, ready to begin the ritual that marks the shortest day of the year. Time, here, is not counted, it is watched, felt, responded to. The gnomon's shadow now lies beyond the dial's edge, lost in the irregular stone of the agora. It points to a place where time escapes measurement, where precision gives way to intuition. And perhaps that is winter's true lesson. In the season of least light, time becomes more human, more forgiving. We do not control it. We join it, stumbling occasionally, adjusting always, trusting that the sun, though distant, will return, and so it does. The winter solstice passes, and the days begin to lengthen once more. Slowly, shadows shorten, the sundial regains its clarity. But for now, in this still moment, you remain suspended in the long twilight of winter time, a time that asks less for accuracy and more for presence. Within the sacred precincts of Delphi, a sundial stands sentinel beside the temple of Apollo. Unlike its civic counterparts in the agora or marketplace, this timekeeper bears inscriptions linking each art to specific rituals. The carving is delicate, its surface worn smooth by centuries of reverent touch. These are not generic lines, they are sacred prompts. They tell priests when to make offerings, mark the intervals when the oracle might emerge from the inner sanctum, and signal the times when dreams should be interpreted. Each shadow cast is more than a measurement. It is a divine whisper. Time in such places was not a neutral utility, it was divine choreography. Religious sundials were often constructed with astronomical precision, their alignment chosen not merely for accuracy, but for significance. Some were placed to catch the very first beam of sunrise on the summer solstice. Others were aligned so that the equinox's midday sun would strike the statue of a god with perfect symmetry. These designs were not just functional, they were expressions of faith, moments where architecture and astronomy met devotion. At Epidaurus, in the sanctuary of Asclepius, the god of healing, a sundial stood near the temple where patients sought miraculous cures. There, the noon shadow was believed to indicate the optimal moment for falling asleep, the state in which divine, healing dreams might be received. Pilgrims gathered around, watching the shadow move slowly across the dial, waiting for its touch to signal their turn. In these moments, time itself was an extension of divine will. It moved not mechanically, but as part of the ritual, sensing mortal hope with celestial rhythm. Temple priests who maintained these devices were more than caretakers. They were astronomers, philosophers, and mystics all at once. Unlike civic timekeepers, often slaves tasked with announcing hours, these priestly horologists held respected roles. Their knowledge of solar paths, atmospheric distortion, and celestial cycles was profound. Some left behind manuscripts detailing their observations. They calculated compensations for the sun's apparent diameter, and they studied how low winter angles distorted the position of shadows. Their instruments were delicate, and their measurements, though silent, carried immense authority. In many temples, the sundial was treated as a sacred object in its own right. At Eleusis, Initiates of the Demeter mysteries would pour libations around a ceremonial sundial as part of their rites. Some believed that the rate of evaporation would influence how accurately the hours were kept. The gnomon in Rhodes was sometimes removed during solar festivals and used as a symbolic staff during processions, a blending of tool and icon. In these spaces, the sundial was no longer just Apollo's tool, it was his voice made visible. Rituals responded to these shadows with great seriousness. At Delos, an annual ceremony required offerings to be placed upon a stone at how precise are the sundial marked as sacred to Leto. Missing this window by even minutes was seen as a grave misstep. In Pergamon, a pair of matched sundials were kept in constant calibration to ensure that temple rites proceeded in perfect unison, despite occurring on different terraces of the sanctuary. The gnomon's shadow was not simply time, it was permission, command, and witness all in one. Yet sacred instruments were not immune to worldly influence. Graffiti discovered on a sundial in Olympia includes a complaint scratched in careful letters accusing priests of altering the markings to extend the period for accepting sacrifices. Another sundial in Dodona bears overlapping carvings, as if someone had tried to remark the hours. Were these attempts to improve accuracy, or to manipulate the divine schedule for earthly gain? We may never know, but the presence of these marks hints at tensions between human interests and sacred order, where even the measurement of time could become political. Some priests describe time not as a flow, but as a wheel, cyclical and endless. The gnomon's shadow, sweeping the same path day after day, echoed this philosophy. Each shadow's return confirmed the cosmos was still in balance. Festivals were timed to solstices and equinoxes, moments when the gods were said to draw closer to the mortal world, and the sundial marked those thresholds with silent certainty. As long as the shadow arrived as expected, the world remained ordered. Standing near the temple at Delphi, you can almost hear the rustle of robes and the low murmur of prayers. The scent of myrrh still seems to linger in the air, carried by a breeze whispering down from Mount Parnassus. A single sunbeam cuts across the marble courtyard and falls upon the gnomon's base, casting its long finger across the dial's surface. You watch it stretch slowly, almost reverently, until it brushes the hour line inscribed for midday, the hour of prophecy. Behind you, a few pilgrims pause in silence, eyes closed as if listening for the god's voice. Nearby, a patch of wildflowers has pushed through cracks in the flagstones. Their petals open in the sunlight, following the same path as the gnomon's shadow. It is a quiet miracle, a living echo of the sundial's rhythms. Time unfolds above and below. The divine and the natural perform the same choreography. Even the bees, moving from flower to flower, seem to hum in time with it. In this moment, everything is synchronized not in measurement, but in meaning. And then, for a heartbeat, the shadow pauses. A thin cloud crosses the sun, the hour line blurs, the spell is broken. You are reminded that even here, at the holiest center of the Greek world, time is fragile. Its symbols are sacred, but its measurement is subject to the sky's whim. Yet, in that interruption, there is meaning too. It is not always the perfectly cast shadow that carries divine truth. Sometimes, it is the moment of stillness, the clouded silence, that speaks most clearly. As the sun returns, the gnomon's shadow finds its line again. Somewhere deeper in the sanctuary, a gong sounds, a priest emerges with a scroll, another day's cycle of rituals begins. But for now, you remain still, hand resting on the warm stone beside the sundial, eyes tracing the shadow's path. In this place, time is not just told. It is revered, it is remembered, it is felt, and in the movement of shadow upon stone, the divine remains measurable, if only briefly, if only by those who know where to look. Within the sacred precincts of Delphi, a sundial stands sentinel beside the temple of Apollo. Unlike its civic counterparts in the agora or marketplace, this timekeeper bears inscriptions linking each hour to specific rituals. The carving is delicate, its surface worn smooth by centuries of reverent touch. These are not generic lines, they are sacred prompts. They tell priests when to make offerings, mark the intervals when the oracle might emerge from the inner sanctum, and signal the times when dreams should be interpreted. Each shadow cast is more than a measurement. It is a divine whisper. Time in such places was not a neutral utility, it was divine choreography. Religious sundials were often constructed with astronomical precision, their alignment chosen not merely for accuracy, but for significance. Some were placed to catch the very first beam of sunrise on the summer solstice. Others were aligned so that the equinox's midday sun would strike the statue of a god with perfect symmetry. These designs were not just functional, they were expressions of faith, moments where architecture and astronomy met devotion. At Epidaurus, in the sanctuary of Asclepius, the god of healing, a sundial stood near the temple where patients sought miraculous cures. There, the noon shadow was believed to indicate the optimal moment for falling asleep, the state in which divine, healing dreams might be received. Pilgrims gathered around, watching the shadow move slowly across the dial, waiting for its touch to signal their turn. In these moments, time itself was an extension of divine will. It moved not mechanically, but as part of the ritual, sensing mortal hope with celestial rhythm. Temple priests who maintained these devices were more than caretakers. They were astronomers, philosophers, and mystics all at once. Unlike civic timekeepers, often slaves tasked with announcing hours, these priestly horologists held respected roles. Their knowledge of solar paths, atmospheric distortion, and celestial cycles was profound. Some left behind manuscripts detailing their observations. They calculated compensations for the sun's apparent diameter and studied how low winter angles distorted the position of shadows. Their instruments were delicate, and their measurements, though silent, carried immense authority. In many temples, the sundial was treated as a sacred object in its own right. At Eleusis, initiates of the Demeter mysteries would pour libations around a ceremonial sundial as part of their rites. Some believed that the rate of evaporation would influence how accurately the hours were kept. The gnomon in Rhodes was sometimes removed during solar festivals and used as a symbolic staff during processions. In these spaces, the sundial was no longer just Apollo's tool. It was his voice made visible. Rituals responded to these shadows with great seriousness. At Delos, an annual ceremony required offerings to be placed upon a stone at the precise hour. The sundial marked as sacred to Leto. Missing this window by even minutes was seen as a grave misstep. In Pergamon, a pair of matched sundials were kept in constant calibration to ensure that temple rites proceeded in perfect unison, despite occurring on different terraces of the sanctuary. The gnomon's shadow was not simply time, it was permission, command, and witness all in one. Yet sacred instruments were not immune to worldly influence. Graffiti discovered on a sundial in Olympia includes a complaint, scratched in careful letters, accusing priests of altering the markings to extend the period for accepting sacrifices. Another sundial in Dodona bears overlapping carvings, as if someone had tried to remark the hours. Were these attempts to improve accuracy, or to manipulate the divine schedule for earthly gain? We may never know, but the presence of these marks hints at tensions between human interests and sacred order, where even the measurement of time could become political. Some priests describe time not as a flow, but as a wheel, cyclical and endless. The gnomon's shadow, sweeping the same path day after day, echoed this philosophy. Each shadow's return confirmed the cosmos was still in balance. Festivals were timed to solstices and equinoxes, moments when the gods were said to draw closer to the mortal world, and the sundial marked those thresholds with silent certainty. As long as the shadow arrived as expected, the world remained ordered. Standing near the temple at Delphi, you can almost hear the rustle of robes and the low murmur of prayers. The scent of myrrh still seems to linger in the air, carried by a breeze whispering down from Mount Parnassus. A single sunbeam cuts across the marble courtyard and falls upon the gnomon's base, casting its long finger across the dial's surface. You watch it stretch slowly, almost reverently, until it brushes the hour line inscribed for midday, the hour of prophecy. Behind you, a few pilgrims pause in silence, eyes closed as if listening for the god's voice. Nearby, a patch of wildflowers has pushed through cracks in the flagstones. Their petals open in the sunlight, following the same path as the gnomon's shadow. It is a quiet miracle, a living echo of the sundial's rhythms. Time unfolds above and below. The divine and the natural perform the same choreography. Even the bees, moving from flower to flower, seem to hum in time with it. In this moment, everything is synchronized, not in measurement, but in meaning. And then, for a heartbeat, the shadow pauses. A thin cloud crosses the sun, the hour line blurs, the spell is broken. You are reminded that even here, at the holiest center of the Greek world, time is fragile. Its symbols are sacred, but its measurement is subject to the sky's whim. Yet, in that interruption, there is meaning too. It is not always the perfectly cast shadow that carries divine truth. Sometimes, it is the moment of stillness, the clouded silence, that speaks most clearly. As the sun returns, the gnomon's shadow finds its line again. Somewhere deeper in the sanctuary, a gong sounds, a priest emerges with a scroll, another day's cycle of rituals begins. But for now, you remain still, hand resting on the warm stone beside the sundial, eyes tracing the shadow's path. In this place, time is not just told. It is revered, it is remembered, it is felt, and in the movement of shadow upon stone, the divine remains measurable, if only briefly, if only by those who know where to look. The small hand reaches out, fingers trembling slightly as they hover above the sundial's carved surface. This is no scholar or seasoned philosopher, but a child, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, being initiated into the mysteries of shadows and angles. In this moment, time ceases to be abstract. It becomes tactile, intimate, and real. The marble's cool smoothness beneath the child's palms brings mathematics to life. In ancient Greece, sundials were not merely learned about, they were lived with. Children grew up in their presence, their education literally etched into the stone. Greek instruction in astronomy often began with simple observations. A child might drive a stick into the earth and mark its shadow's movement across the day using charcoal or chalk. Over time, patterns would emerge. Winter shadows proved longer, summer ones short and quick to pass. Through this slow, deliberate watching, young learners cultivated a sensitivity to light, season, and time. Wax tablets found at excavation sites preserve faint scratchings where students practiced calculating gnomon angles. In many, a teacher's corrections overlay a child's uncertain figures, layers of guidance captured in BESWAX. In schools with greater means, instruction expanded to include physical instruments. There were miniature sundials for student use, some fitted with detachable gnomons to demonstrate latitude, others with bases that could tilt to mimic seasonal change. These were not mere toys or facsimiles. Some surviving examples are accurate to within 15 minutes. One recovered from near Corinth, small enough to fit in a child's palm, has our lines so carefully incised that modern astronomers have used it to reconstruct ancient calibration techniques. What made sundial education powerful was its integration of the theoretical with the physical. Geometry was not confined to the abstract. When a child learned that a line met a curve at a certain angle, they would step outside and watch that truth unfold in a moving shadow. The philosopher Proclus described how Plato, in his academy, would have students predict shadow paths mathematically, then verify their conclusions on actual sundials. Knowledge was not absorbed passively, it was tested, traced in sunlight, confirmed in stone. Even the act of reading was interwoven with timekeeping. Many sundials bore inscriptions urging moral reflection. Phrases such as "use your hours wisely" or "time passes." Your deeds were read aloud by students learning their letters, then copied carefully onto their tablets. These messages reinforce literacy and ethics in equal measure. A sundial was thus both teacher and text. This education was not limited to elites. Rural children learned rudimentary timekeeping from their parents and neighbors. In olive groves, a boy might be told to come home when the sun slipped past a certain branch. On farms, girls might use their own shadows to mark the moment for feeding animals. In many regions, the human body itself became the dial, and experience the teacher. A folktale from Boeotia tells of a shepherd boy who watched the way sunlight moved across a tortoise shell and began marking lines in the dirt. Over seasons, he refined these marks until he carved a crude dial into a flat stone. Elders came to check their own hours by his creation. Whether true or not, the tale speaks to a cultural truth. Time belonged to all who watched the sky. The sundial was not only a scientific object, but a communal symbol. Standardization of sundial instruction varied. Spartan boys likely learned timekeeping only as it related to martial routine. For them, the shadow's length might signal training, eating, or standing guard. In Athens, the pursuit was more academic. Students explored the harmony between light and geometry. On Chios, archaeologists discovered a classroom cache of student sundials, all bearing the same small error. Whether the flaw was intentional, perhaps a teaching trick, or coincidental remains uncertain. What is clear is the dedication to precision and the enduring curiosity of those young minds. Pedagogical use of sundials often included group exercises. One might involve having students arrange pebbles on a flat surface to mark shadow movement. Another asked them to construct a sundial from simple materials, then compare it against the master dial in the school courtyard. These lessons encourage not just accuracy, but collaboration and curiosity. Children learn to ask how time moved, why shadows bent, and what truths could be inferred from the sky. Imagine now one such lesson. A child stands beside a small sundial as the teacher gestures for them to note the hour. The student hesitates, then reaches to trace the line where they believe the shadow will fall. Slowly, minute by minute, the sun moves, the shadow stretches, and when it touches the student's mark, the whole class murmurs in surprise and delight. A lesson in light becomes a triumph of understanding, a fleeting yet unforgettable glimpse into cosmic regularity. The smells of the schoolroom surround the child. There is wax from writing tablets warmed in the sun, the sharp metallic tang of bronze styluses clinking together, the dust stirred by sandals shifting on stone. Outside, the wider world follows its own calendar. Merchants glance at civic sundials to close their stalls. Couriers time deliveries. But within the walls of the school, time is unfolding in discovery, not demand. Education moves with the sky, not the bell. The sundial, in this context, is no longer merely a tool. It is a bridge between child and cosmos, a portal through which knowledge becomes intimate. Each hour passed is not just another division of daylight. It is a lesson completed, a mystery unraveled, a breathless moment where the heavens bow low enough for small fingers to touch. The sundial teaches that knowledge is never static, but always in motion. Like the shadows it measures. As the lesson draws to a close, the teacher reminds the class that time does not wait. They will return tomorrow to measure again, and the shadow will never fall exactly as it did today. In that truth is a final lesson in impermanence of all things, and the power of memory to preserve what the sun forgets. Time's passing is inevitable, but its lessons can endure in the minds that once traced its fleeting path. The child gathers their materials, but before leaving, casts one last glance at the sundial. The shadow is already moving, minute by minute, onward. The lesson may be over, but the learning has just begun. For in ancient Greece, time was not merely taught, it was touched, witnessed, lived. And in that touch lay the seeds of wonder, the beginning of understanding, and the humble sense that knowledge, like the sun, always rises again. The Roman engineers examined the captured Greek sundials with a mixture of admiration and impatience. These instruments, once honored by philosophers and astronomers, are now trophies of conquest, brought from fallen cities to adorn the courtyards and villas of the Italian elite. They are beautiful without question. There are lines etched with precision and artistry, but they pose a problem. Roman timekeeping differs from Greek, and so the engineers are tasked not with preserving, but adapting. Chisels in hand, they bend geometry to new latitudes and ideologies, reshaping time itself to serve a different empire. What once measured celestial perfection now must serve terrestrial authority. The sundial, once sacred in form and function, becomes a symbol of cultural transition. In this moment, it is not only a timekeeper, but a slate for rewriting meaning. Where once a shadow traced the arc of philosophical contemplation, it now measures the hours of administration and military routine. The engineers recarve the lines, with care, but not reverence. The sundial, for them, is a tool before it is a mystery. They work efficiently, not to honor the past, but to serve the empire's expanding demands. Each line they carve is a subtle rewriting of values. The Romans admired Greek sundials, but not always for their intended purpose. Pliny the Elder lamented that wealthy citizens installed intricate dials they could not interpret, treating them as fashionable curiosities rather than useful devices. Imported Greek sundials, designed for Athenian sunlight, often gave incorrect readings in Roman latitudes. This did not matter to those who valued appearance over precision. Status eclipsed accuracy, and utility bowed before spectacle. Roman courtyards boasted these dials like paintings, not instruments. A famous story illustrates this disconnect. Emperor Augustus commissioned a massive sundial in the Campus Martis, using an Egyptian obelisk as the gnomon. It was a monument to imperial ambition, a merger of cultures and symbolism. Yet for years, the sundial failed to function properly. Its readings were off until an engineer erected the angle long after Augustus' reign. The monument had been grand, but technically flawed, a reflection of the empire itself, monumental yet imperfect. Still, Roman pragmatism drove innovation. They standardized our divisions across their territories, reducing the seasonal variability that defined Greek sundials. Instead of dividing daylight into 12 uneven hours that expanded and contracted with the seasons, they pursued temporal uniformity. The hemicyclium, a concave sundial carved into stone, offered better readability. Roman engineers also introduced portable ring dials, small enough to wear around the neck or fasten to a belt, able to approximate the hour anywhere in the empire. In these developments, Roman timekeeping became mobile, scalable, and efficient, yet something was lost in the translation. The Greek sundial was not only a technical object, it was a philosophical statement, embodying harmony between mathematics and the cosmos. It inspired debate about the nature of time, change, and the divine. As sundials spread through Roman provinces, they became more practical but less poetic. A dial in Gaul might keep time adequately, but it no longer inspired contemplation. The beauty of the cosmos gave way to the discipline of the schedule. Historians continue to debate whether this shift marked progress or decline. Accessibility expanded, but meaning diminished. What the Romans gained in utility, they may have sacrificed in spirit. Time, once a phenomenon to be marveled at, became a quantity to be regulated. In their ambition to tame the world, the Romans also tamed the sun, measuring it, dividing it, and aligning it with the empire's calendar. The archaeological record reflects this transformation. Early Roman sundials closely mimic Greek models, preserving decorative motifs and complex lines. These designs carry a whisper of their origin, blending artistry with purpose. Later examples are simpler, plainer, and made from cheaper materials. A particularly telling artifact in a British museum shows a Roman dial carved directly over an older Greek one. The new lines are coarser, more functional. Beneath them, the elegant Greek markings still faintly shimmer in the stone, a ghost of former artistry, the past, overwritten but not entirely erased. Even in distant provinces, sundials became common. In Britannia, archaeologists have uncovered mass-produced examples, likely used by merchants and administrators. These devices served their purpose well enough but bore no inscriptions, no decoration, no philosophical musings. They told time, nothing more. Utility became their only virtue. They were silent companions to commerce, law, and governance. The contrast between Greek and Roman sundials extends beyond form. The Greek dial's shadow moved like a dancer, fluid and precise, inviting interpretation. The Roman shadow marched forward like a soldier, strict and punctual, demanding compliance. One evoked wonder, the other reliability. Neither was inherently superior, but each reflected its civilization's values. Where the Greeks saw in the sundial a dialogue with the heavens, the Roman saw a means of keeping appointments and collecting taxes. In a sunlit courtyard, you might see both instruments side by side. On one pedestal rests an original Greek dial, its lines delicate and curved, its marble surface catching the light in subtle hues. Next to it, a Roman copy, straighter, blunter, and simpler. The light hits them both. On the Greek surface, the shadow seems to hesitate, caressing each hour. On the Roman dial, it falls decisively, as if time itself has no room for pause. These two dials, though separated by intent, still mark the same passing sun. The scent of olive oil lingers in the air, mingling with stone dust and metal filings from the engineer's recent work. You hear the echo of chisels still reshaping ancient curves into imperial lines. The courtyard hums with transformation. In the distance, a merchant calls out the hour, his voice loud and practiced. He trusts his sundial now. It may not be beautiful, but it works, the instruments function, and that is enough. For him, it is not the meaning of time that matters, but its measure. What the Romans achieved with timekeeping was remarkable. They took a Greek inheritance and made it serve the empire. They spread it across continents, into deserts and forests, onto ships and into forums. Sundials became as common as milestones and aqueducts. But in doing so, they also tamed time, stripped it of its mystique, and harnessed it to the needs of bureaucracy and order. Each hour line became a quiet assertion of control, each gnomon a sentinel of Roman authority. Perhaps that was inevitable. Every empire leaves its mark not only on space, but on time. The sundials of Rome were not just instruments. They were inscriptions on history, measuring not only the hours, but the transformation of meaning itself. From Athens to Arles, from Corinth to Cologne, the shadow moved forward not always gracefully, but always relentlessly, across marble and granite, through whispers and chisels. The sundial endured, transformed yet persistent, and now, centuries later, as you stand between these hybrid dials, you sense the tension still etched in stone. Two worlds, to philosophies, joined by shadow. Time may pass, but its memory lingers in the lines we draw to measure it. The sun casts its light impartially, but we choose how to trace it. And in that choice, we tell the story not only of ours, but of ourselves. The Byzantine monk pauses in his copying, eyes drifting to the stone courtyard beyond the cloister. The sundial's shadow approaches the Vespers mark, that familiar hour when prayers rise with the scent of myrrh. But his hand does not stop. The quill moves steadily, its rhythm as practiced as breath. The hour matters less now than it once did. The time is noted? Yes, but only out of habit. On a shelf nearby, a new mechanical water clock ticks with serene precision. Clouds, nightfall, even seasons have little power over its steady pace. And with its presence, the ancient language of shadows begins to slip into memory. By the twilight of antiquity, the role of sundials had begun to change. No longer the centerpiece of public life or philosophical wonder, they became increasingly decorative. In Alexandria, the last recorded sundial in the Great Library was purchased not for use, but for study, a relic to examine, not to rely upon. Across the Mediterranean, Christian churches initially integrated sundials into their architecture. building them into the stone walls of sanctuaries. Some remain, bearing the delicate lettering of Greek art markings, faded now but still whispering of a time when sunlight was a sacred rhythm. Yet gradually, even in holy places, bells began to take precedence. Prayer was no longer dictated by light and shadow, but by chimes regulated by water or, soon, by gears. A 6th-century merchant's ledger found in Constantinople lists sundials, among other acquired goods, mosaics, amphorae, fragments of sculpture. They were curiosities, art objects, not tools. As mechanized timekeeping gained prominence, the sundial became, in effect, a beautiful anachronism. In monasteries, the rhythm of prayer still traced the old solar arcs, but even here, water clocks ensured that the prayers would rise at precisely the right hour, regardless of storm or cloud. And yet sundials never vanished. Their image endured, their quiet authority persisted. In remote farming villages, where mechanical clocks were a rarity, sundials remained functional companions. They stood in garden courtyards, in pasture fields, beside vineyards and olive groves. Farmers measured their days not by the abstraction of bell towers, but by the familiar arc of the sun. Even when pocket watches appeared in the hands of nobles, they were those who preferred the old way, the slow movement of light, the certainty of seasons. What had once been seen as a limitation became, in time, a virtue. The sundial's dependence on sunlight, once its great weakness, began to seem poetic. Its seasonal shifts, formerly seen as inaccuracies, took on an organic charm. It did not resist nature's rhythm, but embraced it. In a world increasingly governed by rigid, unyielding tick-tocks, the sundial offered a gentler experience. It did not command time, but observed it. It recorded only when the sun was present and remained silent when it was not. Medieval Islamic scholars played a crucial role in preserving and expanding sundial knowledge. They translated Greek treatises, added mathematical refinements, and developed intricate designs that far surpassed their predecessors in accuracy. Some of these designs would eventually find their way back to Europe, brought through trade routes and the movement of knowledge during the Crusades. These sundials, adorned with Arabic numerals and precise calibrations, would later inspire the great cathedral builders and Renaissance scientists who reawakened an interest in celestial mechanics. Monastic gardens often retained simple sundials, long after mechanical clocks ruled the bell towers. Here, amid rows of herbs and cloistered vines, the sundial still had a place, not as the master of hours, but as a humble assistant, a nod to tradition. Monks would consult them to mark work, periods, or signal moments of silent prayer. The sundial's shadow fell softly across the thyme and lavender, a quiet participant in the life of devotion. The transformation of the sundial from functional tool to philosophical object is a rare phenomenon. Its loss of utility did not result in obscurity. Instead, it found new meaning. The mathematics once required for accuracy became a source of wonder, the visual harmony of its design an emblem of balance. Its flaws, its dependence on sun and location became metaphors for human finitude, for the subtle truths that escape measurement. Back in the monastery, the monk sets down his quill. He walks slowly to the courtyard, sandals brushing the stone. His eyes find the gnomon and its fading shadow. The marble slab is cracked at the edges, moss creeps in around its base. The hour lines are barely visible, withered by rain, sun, and centuries. Yet the sundial still functions, the shadow still points, still divides the light into hours. He touches the stone, fingertips grazing the grooves once carved by a long-dead artisan. The sun, too, is lower now. The shadow lengthens. Beside the sundial stands the water clock, ticking rhythmically. Its gears turn, its cups drip with regulated certainty. It is faithful, efficient, and precise. It will chime when the next prayer must begin. But the monk lingers with the sundial. He knows the difference. One keeps time, the other reveals it. The scent of candle wax lingers on his robe. The air smells faintly of ink and old vellum, sharpened by the cold marble beneath his hand. Outside the cloister walls, the world changes. Cities grow louder, their hours divided by machinery. But here, within stone and silence, the ancient shadow still falls across the courtyard. The sundial remains, not as a necessity, but as a witness. This is what time becomes when freed from urgency. Not a command, but a conversation. Not a demand, but a gesture. The sundial speaks quietly now, less insistent than the chime of bells or the click of clock hands. But its voice, shaped by sun and stone, endures. And those who listen still find in it the rhythm of a slower world, where time is not chased, but met with stillness. In this space, the monk's gesture becomes part of a lineage. He is not the first to pause here, and he will not be the last. Others will kneel beside the old dial. Others will trace its lines and marvel that, though centuries pass, the shadow remains faithful. It changes with the seasons, shifts with the years, but always returns, a reminder that even as time races forward in the ticking world beyond, there remains a quieter clock beneath the sky, one that measures not only moments, but meaning. The modern city hums around you, a vast chorus of traffic and glowing advertisements, its artificial lights overwhelming the stars above. Yet even here, in a forgotten square tucked between glass towers and tram lines, a single sundial endures. It rests atop a cracked pedestal of old stone, its lines weathered, its gnomon casting a faint shadow. You step closer, drawn not by function, but by reverence. The street lamps spill their orange haze over the marble, but the sundial does not resist. It simply waits, as it always has, for sunlight. Your fingers brush against the carved grooves, and for a moment, you are part of a lineage that stretches across millennia. This is no longer a measuring tool. It is a monument, a survivor, a whisper from an age when time moved with the sun and life slow to match its rhythm. The gnomon's shadow is nearly swallowed by the streetlight's glare, but if you squint, you can still discern it, a quiet survivor amid the urban glow. Sundials have long vanished from practical use, displaced by mechanical clocks, then digital watches, then smartphones. Yet their legacy surrounds us in ways we scarcely recognize. The word dial once referred only to the surface of a sundial. Now it resides on our phones and watches. The concept of clockwise exists only because sundials in the northern hemisphere cast shadows in that direction. Even architecture, with its cardinal alignments and sunlit courtyards, carries traces of mnemonic thinking. There was once a time when every city square, monastery courtyard, and private garden had its own sundial. Children would be taught to tell time by watching the play of shadows rather than listening for chimes. Farmers would plant, harvest, and pray according to the dial's guidance. Time was not a number on a glowing screen, but a shifting pattern of shadow and light, an intimate rhythm sung by the sky. To live with the sundial was to be synchronized with the planet's breath. Here is what sundials gave us that digital clocks never could: a visceral connection to the cosmos. A smartphone delivers numbers on demand, sterile and detached. A sundial asks more of you. It invites you to step into the light, to witness the sun's arc, to feel the day changing around you. It demands participation. You must be present to observe. You must wait. That slowness is part of the gift. Perhaps that is why sundials persist, hidden in parks and cloisters, standing silently in gardens and atop library lawns. They serve no urgent purpose now, but they offer something subtler, more enduring, a form of mindfulness. A moment of stillness in a hurried world. When you read a sundial, you are reading the sky, you are entering a dialogue with the day. The world does not rush around a sundial, it slows. It contemplates. Around you, the city continues. Trains rumble in the distance, neon signs flicker to life. But beside the sundial, time feels different. It breathes, it waits. The surface of the stone is cool under your hand. Its face is a record of centuries, worn smooth by generations of curious fingers and falling rain. You wonder how many people have stood where you are now, watching the play of shadow and stone. Even in this modern age, some sundials remain accurate. If properly aligned and adjusted for longitude and the equation of time, they can still mark the hours with surprising precision. But precision is not the point. A sundial's beauty lies in its simplicity. No ticking gears, no buzzing alerts. Just the earth, the sun, and the patience to watch their silent interplay. The sundial measures not just the hour, but the manner in which it passes. The shadow now grows faint. The street lamp competes with the last threads of dusk. If you crouch low, positioning your eyes just right, you can still distinguish the solar shadow from the artificial one. It trails across the hour lines, soft and reluctant. The sundial is not obsolete. It has simply become something else. Not a tool, but a teacher. Not a necessity, but a reminder. The rhythm it offers is not mechanical, but eternal. You stand there as the city grows darker. The sundial vanishes into silhouette, its markings invisible, its voice quiet, and yet, its presence remains. You know where each line lies. Even if you cannot see them, you remember how the shadow moved. You carry the memory of light. In this way, the sundial continues to speak. It offers a kind of quiet companionship for those who are willing to listen with more than ears. Above, stars begin to flicker into visibility, one by one. These are the same stars that Greek astronomers once mapped, the same constellations that guided travelers and philosophers alike. Time has not stopped, it has simply changed its medium. From solar to sidereal, from shadow to starlight, from sun-drenched courtyards to glowing screens. And yet, even among satellites and atomic clocks, the sundial remains. Not forgotten, but reimagined. You close your eyes and listen. Not to clocks, but to the world itself, the distant hum of traffic, the breeze moving through leaves, alone, bird calling out before rest. The sundial says nothing now. And yet, you understand, some truths are not spoken. Some rhythms are not measured, but felt. The silence is not emptiness, but fullness waiting to be perceived. The marble beneath your fingertips is smooth and cold, its surface holding the touch of countless others. The gnomon stands straight, indifferent to modernity, unwavering in its purpose, and though it casts no useful shadow now, it remains ready, waiting for the return of light, waiting to speak again. When dawn comes, it will do what it has always done. It will tell the truth, quietly and without pride. You turn to leave, your steps slow, measured. Behind you, the sundial rests quietly in the dark, not forgotten, not broken, simply dormant, like a story waiting for sunlight. It will still be there tomorrow, and the day after, and perhaps long after the city has changed again. It asks nothing, demands nothing. It simply is. This is how the sundial endures, not through utility, but through meaning. In a world that spins faster each day, it reminds us that time is not a commodity. It is a relationship, a conversation between stone and sky, between light and life. And if we are willing to pause, to truly look, the sundial will still speak, quietly, faithfully, eternally. It waits, as we should, for the light that always returns. End of script. Sweet dreams.